Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Three Wonks, this time right after Thanksgiving. Nice Thanksgiving holiday for the three of us, various states of vacation and whatnot. And I personally had a great time in my vacation, at least so far. I've got one more day left. Then it's back to the grindstone for me personally. And I hope everyone else had a good holiday as well. Of course, Three Wonks, policy focused podcast. And if you want to support us over on Patreon, it's patreon.com/the Three Wonks. One of the cool perks is you get a say in what we talk about on a week to week basis. This week, we're going to be talking about the greatest economy in the world. What is it? And why do the hosts think so? But before that, we're taking a wonky dive into a book that Micah really recommended. He says Radical Markets by a couple of guys. They wrote this book. That's what they called it. And we're going to talk about it. Okay. And it's going to be part of hopefully an ongoing series where we take somewhat of a deep dive or a critical look at different sort of, I guess you could say ideological worldviews in terms of how the economy should be set up and, political institutions should be set up. And we talk about them and we see what we agree and disagree with. And obviously, Radical Markets, I think Micah once described it as one of the only sort of cohesive, worldview systems of current liberal thinkers. It seems like socialists are always willing to write down how they would design the entire economy, but I guess liberals are less likely to do that for one reason or another. STL, you had something you wanted to?
No, I think I might have said that, and it's exactly that.
Oh, okay.
The difficulty is that something that we've talked about is we want to review maybe these models, these attempts at outlining an alternate society, and obviously there's a lot more socialists who want to outline an alternative society than liberals, but it is interesting in the sense that the Radical Markets view is like, hey, liberalism isn't complete. We need to go further. Whereas many liberal writers seem to basically be like, yeah, we got it right. It's time to tinker around the edges.
End of history. History's over.
It's like, well, that's just, that's almost certainly wrong, right? Like right. Surely there have to be more innovative ways of producing almost everything in society.
And so we're going to talk about one of those potential avenues, Radical Markets, I guess, later today. So hopefully that should be fun. Guys, how was everyone's Thanksgiving break? SDL, Micah, how was Thanksgiving?
I mean, Thanksgiving was great. Look, it's always a good excuse to eat a lot of food and make small talk with friends while you do dumb stuff with the children who are screaming and running around. What more is there to look for in life?
All right.
Personally, I think Thanksgiving is an embodiment of American colonization and imperialism. So I spent the day just mourning everything that this country has. No, of course not. No, it was fun. I had 3 different Thanksgivings. Got to see my cousins, which
in the pre-stream you said was mostly green beans. Just to be clear, I
ate mostly. I'm on a keto diet. I'm on a keto diet because my pancreas is very much dysfunctional. I'm a diabetic, so I ate green beans. And SDL thinks that's hilarious. He thinks diabetes is funny. If any of y'all have any sort of disability, I just want you to know that the socialism done left thinks that's hilarious.
There's just the idea of going from one Thanksgiving to another. Like you drive, you roll in, and they just hand you the green beans.
Something it's all over. I literally eat everything, and I ate turkey as well. Okay, let's clear this up a little bit. And a lot of unsweetened tea because I am a true Texan, and I believe in drinking our state drink because I'm a patriot.
Okay, that's fair. All right, that sounds good. Yeah, I just went to one single Thanksgiving. I didn't have 3 different Thanksgivings like Micah over here. Overconsumption in a capitalist world. Example number 1. But no, I just went to my one family's Thanksgiving, my wife's family, and it was pretty good. We enjoyed ourselves hanging out with family and whatnot. My family is in kind of an awkward, quarter life stage where basically there's a lot of the generation of kids from my generation who are old now and married and shit, but there's very few little kids in my family at this point because all the kids my age have not had kids yet. So there's really no kids at our family Thanksgivings anymore. I guess we really need
Everyone's
to stop
too
fucking
synced
around.
up. Like you're all in like the same cycle, but you need one like people to go like 5 years off or something.
Yeah, we need one person to be like the snowflake that starts the avalanche and really just starts having children. But that's my Thanksgiving. So not many little kids disrupting things, I guess, at this point. But anyway, yeah, glad everyone had a good Thanksgiving. Well, let's get into it, guys. Let's get into our main topic of the week. Radical markets, something that Micah, I believe, recommended. At least I think he said he had read it. SDL had recommended it as well. We're going to talk about this book. Micah, why are we talking about this book? Why do we care about this book known as Radical Markets?
Right. So we wanted to do a series on alternative economic systems because there's pretty much no accessible material on these different economic models. A lot of people talk about socialism, but they don't really talk about what socialism looks like. And I found this very interesting. SEL finds this very interesting, and so does Econoboy. So I thought we were really well positioned to serve this function. Now, radical markets in particular, as was mentioned earlier, is a really unique, I think, attempt at bringing back the radical liberal tradition from the early stages of liberalism, where liberals were not just fighting for a democratic society and individual rights, the kind of things we've won already, but also a much more egalitarian social order. It was basically liberal means to egalitarian ends. And so they're actually explicit in this. The authors talk about how they're trying to bring back radicalism, and they're Georgists, which we talked a lot about on this podcast. They believe that land should be socialized in like market mechanisms for achieving a more egalitarian order. And the book is written in response to the context of 2018. That's when the book came out. Stagnation and rising inequality. They call it stagnequality, I believe, a really cute term. And so you can actually see a lot of the ideas that come from it are based in trying to solve this problem of having economic growth and trying to enhance economic growth while also trying to handle the issue of inequality. So there's multiple different ideas here, but I think the most interesting one is the common ownership self-assessed tax. Estelle, do you want to explain this to everybody?
I mean, let's start with just the base Georges tax and then alter it a bit. So the base Georges tax would be some attempt to only tax the value of land. So you would take property. Right now in property tax, you're both taxing the value of the land, which is a function of where the land is and what's around it. So for example, if you live near a park, it might be higher. If you live far, it might be lower. And then also the property built upon it. But the Georges tax would say, screw the property part of that. We're only taxing the land. Well, this is a nice idea. However, it's fiendishly difficult to do in practice. Because figuring out what the value of the land is absent the value of the property is really difficult. In the book, Whale and the co-author provide an example of New York State, like Empire State Building area. What is the value of the land under the Empire State Building? Well, minus the Empire State Building, the value might go down quite a bit because there's this whole thing built up around where the Empire State Building is. So in short, it's a little bit difficult to try and evaluate the value of the land alone. So they argue. So what is the solution to this? Well, they actually point to Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary founder of China, which is an extremely funny aside, who was interested in using self-assessment as a way of resolving this issue. So Sun Yat-sen's system was you would decide what the value of the land that you're sitting on is worth. But the flip side of that is that whatever the value you set it at, the state could buy from you. So if you wanted to pay really low land taxes, you would set it really low. And the state would say, wow, you think the Empire State Building is only worth $1? Ka-ching, and they'd come in and buy it. The problem with this method, they argue, is that the state just never did this. So like Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists in China got completely destroyed by Mao. They fled to Taiwan, and they never actually did the land seizures that would come with this. Like they were like, let's do self-assessment. And everyone was like, it's worth $1. And the government was like, great, we are never seizing this land ever. So that didn't work, right? That was a bad idea. And then finally we get to self-assessment, which I feel like I talked for so long, I want to pivot it back to Micah, but...
Right. So this is a Harberger tax, and we've talked about this before, but basically the way it works is you assess the value of property, and you have to pay a tax rate on that assessment. And so that's what makes you want to not over-assess it, put it at an unlimited amount. But what makes you not want to under-assess the value of your property is the fact that people can buy it from you. And Sun Yat-sen's idea was that the state could buy it from you. But their idea is actually to apply this much more broadly, to apply this to basically all significant assets. So this could include your home. They say most realistically it would be capital assets for businesses. So if you're a business and you own a factory and a truck and all these different things that you have, you would basically assess the value each year or on a periodic timetable and say, my factory is worth $1 million, right? And you'd pay a 7% tax on that. And anybody at any time could choose to pay you the self-assessed value for that factory. And the idea that's behind this is that this would do two things simultaneously. First of all, it would basically eviscerate wealth inequality. It'd be as if everybody was leasing their assets from the government and all wealth was in part largely socialized. And so wealth inequality would dissipate and the government would get huge amounts of revenue. But the second thing is the efficiency argument for this model is that it would lead to a more efficient distribution of assets. A lot of, whenever we're going to purchase, let's say, a new piece of real estate, we only can purchase the pieces of real estate that are on the market. If you're going to shop for a new cargo truck, you can only shop for cargo trucks which are currently for sale. This would make every single piece of capital asset in the entire country on sale 24/7. And it would constantly make people reevaluate how much they actually value specific assets, leading to way more transactions, way more times assets switch hands. Assuming, or presumably to people who will use those assets more efficiently. What do we think about this idea, folks?
I don't really know. I guess I'm not sure why we would expect it to collapse wealth inequality a lot. Like the only reason I say that is because we can look at like the stock market, which is a highly liquid sort of market for exchange. Obviously, you can buy any stock at any time. It always has a strike price that you can pay. But we don't really see like very horizontal ownership of the stock market, right? So how is it different?
But you're charging them a 7% tax on it. So it's like it's like now everybody's leasing their assets from the state. And the average rate of return on capital is something like 8-9%. So the government's taking the vast majority of the return on capital for itself.
Let me try and rephrase this in another way. This is a 7% self-assessed wealth tax.
Yep.
And I guess corporate capital assets tax, the argument of how it would reduce inequality is, one, they argue that a lot of present inequality results from monopolies. So they argue that this would reduce the power of monopolies. The reason that monopolies raise inequality is because they lower wages, which we know to be true. They lower wages on average, maybe around 8%, just from monopoly power in the United States, somewhere in that range. And then they raise prices. And again, the prices are raised maybe on the order of like 5 to 20%. Again, just the United States. So like if you lower that would tend to be a distribution from the rich to the poor, who have to pay higher prices and get lower wages. So it's a distribution from capital owners to labor owners is sort of the idea.
Yeah, the tax proportion, that makes more sense than, for some reason I missed that. I thought you guys were saying, it sounded like it's like, we're just going to basically
you
create
could have
everything.
a 0% tax and it would just be as if all property was on the auction. That's
Right.
like a libertarian, you will own nothing and be happy utopia. But this is weirdly like a Georgist version of that.
Yeah, that was something that I got from one of the author's lectures on this, was like, this is kind of a, it's markets, but it's also everything's kind of commonly owned if you think about it. So do you call this socialism? I'm not sure. I like this guy named Henry George is kind of the way that he framed it. But anyway, what were you going to say, STL?
No, just they have a quote in their book. Let me pull it up. I'm not finding it quickly, but it was they were referencing Walras. So Walrasian equilibrium. Walras considered himself a kind of socialist, and this was the kind of socialism that he described. Was he liked markets and he hated property, was essentially the gist of it. So what if you could have some way that no one truly owned property and everyone was leasing property from the state? Well, this is sort of the Walrasian. He called it, I believe, synthetic socialism. But I can pull up an exact. Yeah, it was synthetic socialism. And the gist of it is that one of the reasons Walras was interested in this is it's a way of getting the benefits of social ownership, or at least some of them. I would argue not all of them. Some of the benefits of social ownership without having to do central planning. So Walras was very, very skeptical of central planning. And clearly so are Whale and the radical markets and the tradition it comes from are very skeptical of central planning. So they trust the market. They believe in the market. In fact, more than I would argue many capitalists. They're like, we should give even more power to the market and less to property owners, right? So I think it's interesting in that sense. I like to use the phrases marketarian and propertarian. There's many libertarians who are propertarian. They're really, really, really interested in making sure that nobody can ever touch your property ever. And the entire purpose of the state is to make sure that property is never effed with by anyone else. And they don't want the government to intervene with your property either. Oh, you made a monopoly? That's fine. The state shouldn't intervene in a monopoly. You did so rightfully with your property. The marketarian says, F that. I don't give a damn what your property says. I want an efficient market. And if that means I have to crack heads, I'll do it. I'll crack as many eggs as I need to. And so I think it's a sort of interesting, I think it's an interesting extension of liberalism as marketarianism to like its natural logical conclusion.
That makes sense. And
Right. I mean, there's freedom, and freedom, I think a lot of libertarians make the case for markets, but their actual ideology is just about having no state intrusion. But like, within firms, that's not market interactions, right? Within families, it's not market interactions. Long-standing rigid contracts are not market interactions. This is actually much more market-based than what many people advocate for. So like I said earlier, I think these are the kind of ideas that we should be talking about more. I think liberals need to recapture their ambition. And I think there's something that needs to be done about people like Elon Musk, who, may be a trillionaire in our lifetime. Clearly, this is not a reasonable form of distribution in our society.
Micah, scooch to your left. You're a little off-center. Thank you, Micah.
This is better. Okay. With that being said, I think this idea is actually quite bad. I commend the authors, but I think it's a pretty terrible idea because it might increase allocative efficiency, but there's all of these evaluation costs which must be induced. Think about trying to evaluate the constant value of every asset. Also, think about the divisibility of assets. Does my factory include the machines? Does it include the desks? Right? Like the
to be clear on the divisibility one, they do argue there should be some ability to package your assets. But this then it furthers the first problem. If you're able to package your assets, that means you need to evaluate each one in series and then package them into one thing. Like you're on your smartphone evaluating each chair in your office, and you're putting all the individual chair assets into the firm asset. It's like, well, who actually does? Who's the time to do this? I totally believe that the self-assessment is actually the burden they suggest. If it's applied truly to all capital, they have this example where they suggest you wouldn't want to have divisibility that's too small, because what if someone bought your left shoe and left you without a right shoe? And this was sort of a comedic example, but I was like, that actually illustrates how insane it would be to have to evaluate each of my shoes, right? Like what the
right. Well, it's like you're about to take you have a business for shipping, and somebody just bought all your trucks. So everything's just sitting at the port and you can't bring your stuff anymore. Now I guess you could force people to evaluate the entire value of their business. Maybe you could you start from there and then you could.
First, Micah
was censoring. Go ahead, Micah.
No, you could have the requirement that people evaluate their entire business and then decompose it from there. I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea because maybe you could reduce, maybe acquisition costs are too expensive and it takes a lot of time for these transactions to happen. I think the tax is a pretty bad idea though as well. A 7% tax on capital assets would basically ravage the accumulation of assets in our country. I think about whenever you invest in a factory or any piece of capital, you think at the expected rate of return you're going to receive on it. A 7% tax slapped on it is going to dramatically reduce the expected return you can get on capital assets, and therefore it's going to dramatically reduce capital formation. I mean, that's at a 7% rate. This isn't just some neoclassical whining. I mean, that's a really significant burden that obviously would lead to a lot less capital formation, and that would be a pretty bad for the economy.
And to be clear, they do they try to divide the sort of problems that Micah's talking about into what they call allocative efficiency versus investment efficiency. So the allocative efficiency idea is that sometimes an economy can be made better off, a society can be made better off just by redistributing assets. Right. If someone owns a farm, but they're really bad at working it, society would be better off if it was transferred to someone who was better at working it. It's not hard to imagine that. That was sort of what happened in the productivity boom after feudalism. But allocative efficiency is not total efficiency. They raise this idea of investment efficiency that, well, let's say you've redistributed the field to the guy who can work it most usefully. That doesn't necessarily mean that the guy is going to invest into the field or invest into his own stock of tractors and other capital, unless he has security in thinking those will return him some yield. And so the difficulty is that you need a system which encourages people to invest. And a tax discourages that. And also, the lack of security in your assets alone may actually potentially discourage that. Why would I upkeep my home if I know there's a chance that someone else is going to steal it off me? In fact, I may want to systematically fail to upkeep my assets in ways that are not visible to the public in such a way that I can overvalue my assets relative to their real value. And so you might have a systematic underinvestment for multiple reasons. One is that a tax is just a straight up disincentive. And two is that there's sort of an auction game going on here where you want to pretend that every asset you own is as valuable as possible while doing as little as possible to take care of it. It makes everyone a used car salesman.
Right. And I think the point to piggyback off of this is there's this assumption that I think is here, and they're very thoughtful people. So I'm not going to try to strawman them at all. But there's an idea that if you can just list the price for assets, you can just eliminate the transaction costs. And the reality is a lot of the time it takes currently to do these transactions is because people are investigating the real value of property. Like, I need to look at your factory. I need to go inside and know how much it's worth. I need to look at the miles on your truck before I know how much it's worth. So just listing the asset on, like, its value online, I don't know, maybe there's some usefulness for that for some things. Maybe it gives you a better starting point. But it doesn't just mean transactions are going to be instantaneous, at least if you want them to be efficiently priced.
Right. This is almost like saying, well, because we value so many properties like houses each year, then we get like exponentially better at valuing property each year when it seems like actually, yeah, like obviously there's some expertise that governments and like consultants can have with valuing property that it establishes itself over time. But it seems like we still need this regular valuation process that's very sort of cost intensive every single year, despite the fact that we do it every single year for every single house. And the people seem to prefer this as well to some degree because, hey, I want a fresh valuation because I don't want to pay more property tax than I have to. So yeah, it's not clear that decentralizing it would solve that problem. STL?
So I will offer some defenses. These are partial. One is that you would raise a lot of money with a tax like this, and you disproportionately be raising it from the rich. If you gave it out in something akin to a UBI, you'd be raising aggregate demand quite a bit. And if you raise aggregate demand, that may also raise the incentive to invest because now there's more demand to be filled. It might still represent a shift away from investment as like an incentive. Like every person will be less incentivized to invest. However, it's possible to imagine that allocative efficiency might increase so much and aggregate demand might increase so much that you see like a net close to zero or net positive effect. Like, I think you'd have to do the math on that to work it out, but
I don't know. I mean, I you know, you're taking money out of investment and, you know, from the wealthy, and you're giving it to lower income folks on net. Obviously, you're cannibalizing a bit of the wealth base, so you're going to see a loss of assets, which is going to reduce the revenue estimate a little bit. But okay, demand goes up a lot. I agree that would happen, but you don't want inflation, right? Because there's only, you know, so high aggregate demand can go, which means the central bank almost certainly would have to raise interest rates. So the actual net,
just for the sake of making the thought experiment work, imagine you implemented this slowly over like 10 years. So there's no sudden inflation burst. It's like a slow shifting of incomes from the rich to the poor.
Right.
Then capacity could build out and so on, right?
But like, you know, if the assumption is that if the central bank's doing its job, the economy is always running hot, right, as we'd want it to, which means aggregate demand is always at its optimal level, which means that this wouldn't actually change things. It would just be like, well, we're doing it via this, you know, redistributive mechanism rather than, you know, the central bank's interest rate mechanism. So I don't think that we could expect a huge long-term, you know, investment effects from larger demand from this if the central bank was doing its job. And yeah, I don't know. I just think the allocative efficiency argument is kind of weak sauce. I don't doubt that there's some allocative efficiency that can be achieved, but it seems like cannibalizing your incentive to invest this much would be a huge problem.
So I do want to offer, again, another partial defense. I think it's insane to apply this to all assets. And it's probably insane to even apply this to most assets. However, it makes complete sense to apply this to assets which are closer to monopolies. So the gist of their argument, they, in fact, I believe, open their book with the idea that property is monopoly. Well, there's some kinds of property that are closer to monopoly than others. So stuff like land is an obvious one. It is very hard to produce new land. In fact, it is impossible to produce new land in a given location as current land. You can only do it in like the sea or something. So because land is very close to monopoly, unlike capital investment, you can't just create another factory that's exactly the same as the land. in these cases, I do think these kinds of taxes make more sense, and the allocative efficiency argument makes more sense. Because only one person can have the land, it makes a lot of sense to distribute it to the person who can use it most efficiently. There's a big difference with that and the idea of like, I don't know, who can use a truck the most efficiently, and these sort of like divisible assets and so on. Where it's like, well, I could also just buy more trucks. Like, I don't need to buy it from the guy who's got some used trucks. I could just buy it from the used truck salesperson. Like, I don't need to buy it directly from Target's truck used supply. I can buy it from used truck supply guy. It's not clear there's huge allocated efficiency gains there, but for land, it seems very obvious. And I will extend this in a second after we talk to other property types.
This is like
I think radio waves is a perfect example.
Yes, so the spectrum.
This is like the high IQ meme where it's like the low IQ guy is like, just tax land. The medium IQ guy is like, no, we need the radical markets and do all these self-assessments. And then the high IQ guy is like, just tax land. We don't actually need to do it.
Giga Chad. Yeah. I think the radio spectrum is another perfect example. Any asset that's like land, which is natural, this can make sense for. Also, we talked about previously in a video about intellectual property, applying the Harberger tax concept. Now, my argument back then was, it's intellectual property is a reward for innovation, right? You get a patent for putting on in all these research and development costs. So if you slap a large tax on it, that could reduce your incentive to innovate, right? Because the actual expected value of your intellectual property right has gone down. But something that we all agreed on back then was that at least requiring people to list a value for their intellectual property right so that it could be sold would be very useful, because there's so many intellectual property rights which are taken out, patents which are formed and never used, which almost certainly could be allocated more efficiently if there was more of if there's an automatic auction system in place.
To try to speak to, so this is a very minor example, but I thought it was a very cute one they pointed to, of property that is basically only a monopoly is domain squatters. So if you've ever gone to like a domain for some old website, there's like a 90% chance that someone has like bought it up, and now it's like advertising like, honestly nowadays 90% of the time it's like Indian language gambling or whatever for some reason. It's like I don't know why that is, but all the squatters are either doing like vague CEO bait or like Indian gambling, and I don't know why. But that's not a productive use of the assets. Like it doesn't make sense for people to be running a server that like 3 people are seeing and they're just seeing slop. That's like a complete waste of assets, a complete waste of internet space. So what if you could own a domain, but you just had to pay a significantly higher fee to own that domain over time? Well, you probably have less domain squatters because it's not worth, right now it costs like $12 to park a domain. What if it was $100? Well, then a lot of people would park a domain. So that's the same idea. If you scale it up to the idea of like intellectual property rights, there's people who try and patent troll. They try and say, I invented this one step of this 1,000-part process. And if you don't pay me a bajillion dollars, I'm not going to license you step 563 of your 1,000-step process to produce like anti-cancer drugs. Well, Now you've got a thing where you can just put a value on it, right? Oh, like I think this patent is actually super valuable. Well, then you're going to have to pay a really high tax on that, buddy. Or they can just buy it out from you if you value it really low. So there is a value of allocative efficiency of being able to streamline and vertically integrate some of those patents. And I will just, as a final note on this, the argument we had for these kind of taxes for intellectual property, it seems obvious that you might be able to offset it just by subsidizing research and development. You might be able to just directly do it through state investment. You might also be able to do it through tax subsidies. Like you might be able to let people full expensing, for example. You could imagine like, I don't know, extra full expensing for intellectual property. Again, that's like a difficult credit. Right. It's a difficult burden, but if your goal is like, hey, this tax is hurting intellectual property because we're taxing it, well, let's subsidize it on the other end. They're both sort of difficult, but you might be able to work it out close to zero.
Yeah, I think one way to put that as well is that this might not work well in a lot of industries because we imagine it might create disincentives to invest, but it's also doing that in industries that probably aren't super heavily rent seeking or like that are pretty competitive in and of themselves. Like if we were to imagine, the classic sort of in this last election, the classic sort of neoliberal criticism of like Kamala's platform was like, oh, but these grocery stores, they're super low profit margin anyway, which is kind of fair, right? It's like, well, I don't know if we need this sort of radical change in how the grocery markets are run, because it seems to be fundamentally a decently competitive process with not a lot of unproductive rent seeking in it, just because of the structure of the market. But with something like IP or land, where it's almost a structure of those markets that they are very rent seeking, then something akin to this makes sense. And what you'll find maybe as we go further along in this this series of looking at different sort of model breakdowns is a plural approach probably just makes sense, right? And I don't even know. I mean, I don't know how. I guess I don't know how strict the authors are in defending this model. I don't even know if they would disagree with that. Maybe they are like really weirdly.
So they think it should be applied to all capital assets, but they even mentioned that even large household assets like homes and potentially cars would count. But I think they understand it's sort of unrealistic, right? Just imagine somebody just buys your house quickly. Now, to respond to something that SEL said, then we can move on. Yeah, you could subsidize capital accumulation or research and development to offset the tax. Although, of course, subsidies have their own costs, right? There's fraudulent claims people can make. There's also zombie research and capital accumulation. You can keep kind of inefficient things alive by using government money. And I think the argument I would make is I think we underproduce research and development. So it's not good enough to have zero impact on it. We want to boost the friggin' hell out of it. But if you guys want to learn about our views more on that, you can look at our previous video on the topic. Now, the next thing they talk about in this book is quadratic voting. Does anybody want to explain what that is?
You'd probably do the best job, but my understanding is it's almost like a personally weighted intensity of voting. Like if you feel really strongly about something, you can allocate more votes to a certain thing. And then there's some mathematical chicanery on the back end, but give us the in-depth explanation.
Right. So basically their idea is right now democracy measures people's preferences. So, if 50% plus one people prefer a certain outcome over another, that's the outcome that we will get. But their argument is, doesn't the intensity of preferences also matters? It doesn't just matter what your preference is. Maybe 49.99999% of people really prefer X outcome over Y outcome. And because they really prefer it, maybe that outcome should be the one that we have. And they frame this as a necessity to protect maybe minority rights against majorities that don't have a really strong interest in a policy. And so the way this works is everybody gets a certain number of voice credits every single year. They have a budget of basically democracy points. And they can spend one on every issue, and that counts as one vote. Or they can spend more of those credits on one issue, and each point they spend has a diminishing value until it's almost nothing. But you could spend, let's say I only care about cannabis legalization. So I say I'm not going to vote in any of the other elections this year. I'm going to spend all of my points on legalizing cannabis. Maybe I could get 9 votes instead of 1 and give up my voice on other issues. I think that this is an interesting idea. I don't think it makes sense with our current democratic institutions really at all, but I'm not necessarily against it. Although I don't know if it actually would lead to any significant change in policy outcomes.
Yeah, I don't really know. I've heard people like star voting people and like score voting people will say the same thing. They'll say like, oh, isn't it important to recognize the intensity of someone's feeling in how we weight the votes, right? So if you're doing a score ballot, rating someone like a 5 out of 5, that's like a really intense, like I really love this person versus weighting someone like a 3 out of 5. And that, that person effectively gets like pulled higher into the probability of winning because you rated them a 5 instead of a 3. But I guess I just don't, maybe the premise can be explained in a way that's intuitive to me. Like, I don't really know why we would necessarily want to value the intensity of someone's preference in terms of a democratic ballot. Like on the argument of protecting minority rights, it feels like you could just as easily say the opposite, that like a 30% of the country that's like super crazily racist would have like an outsized influence on policy. So I don't know. It just kind of seems like it would go both ways. STL, seems like you wanted to jump in.
Well, and I did want to take the thought experiment to its natural conclusion. If everyone has the same budget, but minorities are essentially forced or believe they have to spend on issues close to their hearts, that means they're spending less on other issues. So what you're essentially saying is, as a black person, it's good that you're protecting your civil rights, but your voice is less valuable on literally everything else. Oh, you a trans person? You want to preserve access to trans medicine? Your voice matters less on literally everything else. That just doesn't seem reasonable to me. Like, the thing I care about for democracy is some attempt to try and make everyone reasonably happy. And it's not clear that reducing people's voices on issues that are like further from their preferences is a way of doing that, rather than like it's just not clear that this would lead to better outcomes.
Right. I think that's a good point, because it seems like something that we've identified is many times minorities are actually getting what they want at the expense of the majority. And these are not minorities like, trans people, although, actually I think sometimes they get an unfair shake. It's not like the trans people are running society. What's happening is connected special industry groups, or maybe NIMBYs, do things that benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else. And this would seem to actually give them even a little bit more power to do that.
Yeah, I mean, like, imagine that the people in your neighborhood, they really oppose development, and judging by like how people show up to community meetings, a lot of them really do oppose development. Like, they could put all their money into opposing all their democracy money into opposing development. It's like, well, I don't know why their vote should matter more, because they care about it more. Like, I guess that to me, the only thing that I think democracy. The only thing that I feel should ever impact like whose votes matter is this person competent enough to make this decision? And like, I think, I don't know if we've talked about epistocracy type solutions on here. I think there's interesting arguments around those. But right now, the only things that we condition a person's vote on are they like a convicted felon in some states, which I don't think is reasonable. Some convicted felons are smarter than plenty of regular voters.
Trump vote.
Trump should be able to vote. Like, literally, yes. I am a radical pro Trump being able to vote-ist. And two, are they like mentally capable of voting? And that's the argument for like age limits, and that's the argument sometimes for like people who are wardens of the state not being able to vote type stuff. And like, to me, I think that's the only justification that makes sense. Why should it be that the strength of your preference means that you are more informed on something? I just can I speak to this very briefly? Yesterday, I was going through all of the minor candidates in elections from 1996 to 2024 to try and see how the ideology shifted over time. And like 80% of the minor candidates are just completely insane. Like, they think that God is telling them to run. There's this one guy who is literally blind and said he was given a vision by God when he was 7 that Israel and the United States had to unite into one country. And so that's his vision, and he's running for it. And I'm like,
Benjamin Netanyahu.
And I'm like, I want you as far from power as possible. I don't care how strong this preference is. Like, you should not have any more ability to vote on the Israel joining America bill than I do. Like, that's ridiculous.
Well, I think that one of the things, and maybe this could be explained by the authors in a better way. One of the things that he talks about, like one of the problems with our democracy and our voting system, he says is, it's like the strategic voting is a really big problem. And like SDL said, it's just not clear to me that this actually helps that problem at all, because like you said, if you had to budget essentially your voting preference, well, like SDL said, I would have to like really think strategically about what are the things that I really, really, really care about. And unfortunately, I'm just going to kind of have to let those other people vote on the other things. And of the things that are left to vote on that I don't care intensely about, it's like only the people that care very intensely about those things who are represented in the outcome, which I don't know if that's desirable, that like, it's like very disproportionately the intensely, feeling amongst us that are deciding on all these policies, like compartmentally speaking. I just don't know if that's the right thing to do. Like Micah said, it's like, now you've got like disproportionate representation of like NIMBYs on housing issues, racists on race issues, like transphobes on transphobe. Like, I just like, why would we want to vote that way? It just seems rough to do it that way. But maybe there's a more robust defense of such a system.
So I'm going to try to steelman them. But first, I think that the summary of what we're saying is the problem of American democracy is not a problem of the tyranny of the majority. It's often the tyranny of many entrenched minorities and just ineffective governance. Now, regarding the steelmanning of their position, if you make the assumption that people that have really strong views on issues are people that are very knowledgeable about those issues, then I suppose you could say this makes sense, right? So like, let's say the people that know about healthcare will use all their points on healthcare, and they won't use their points on climate change because they don't know anything about it, right? And so like, we have this like segregation of society into people who are very strongly and very passionate and knowledgeable about certain issues and not others. But it seems like most likely in our country, there's people that are more knowledgeable about like everything, and there's people who don't know anything about anything. And so insofar that you might want to have an unequal weighting of preference, you might want to have like maybe you could take a education, like a civics test and get more democracy points. And like you could have more of your vote can count twice as much. I don't think that's practical at all, but I think that would make a lot more sense if that was the problem you were trying to solve than the quadratic voting idea.
I did just want to raise, like, I think one of the ideas that they're trying to get at with quadratic voting is what's called packaging. So democracies package policies. When you voted in the 2024 general election, you voted for the Democrat or you voted for the Republican. American politics is like super packaged. You have two choices that can actually win. So either you vote for package A or package B, and there's no in-between options. And you don't have any option to pull out individual policies of either of the package to be like, yeah, I love package A, except for this one policy, and I'd like to do a little swap with package B. You largely can't do that, except in the states with direct democracy, and even there it's fairly weak. So I feel like some of the issue they're trying to get at is that it would be nice, if we think democracy is mostly useful, to depackage a little bit, to give more input on multiple policies. Well, one of the ways of doing so is just having more direct democracy, period. Like most states in the United States do not have meaningful direct democracy. It is very hard to get something on the ballot. I know Florida, what was it, 57% of people voted to protect abortion, but you need to get 60%. There's all these limits we put on direct democracy. If you think democracy is useful, you can just depackage it by giving more democracy. One of the other things you can do is many governments, and this is something that I've promoted for a while, is depackaging the executive. So right now, most parliamentary systems, you vote for parties, they go to Congress, and Congress sets the policies of the country. And that's it. Like, that's the one body that controls everything. Well, the United States, we have a separate executive branch, but there's only the one guy. You're entirely voting for Kamala Harris or Trump, and there's no in-betweens. It's not even like you're voting for a council of like 5 dudes. You're voting for one guy, and they control literally everything. Well, what if it was like 40 dudes and you voted for the dude in charge of healthcare and the dude in charge of taxation and the dude in charge of the military? That would meaningfully give you more input on each of these issues in particular. And if we're talking about like the ability of people to know and like speak about issues intelligently, I think there is value of having people be able to talk about one issue at a time. Like, just talk about healthcare. Who cares about Trump's policy on immigrants or whatever? Let's compare his concept of a plan with whatever Kamala wants to put out and just compare those one-on-one and do an intellectual gladiator, a marketplace of ideas, and see which comes out on top. That seems way preferable to me than the current system of Glenn Whale, which is almost like taking the current system. You have to vote on every issue, and now not only are you voting on every issue, but you have to weight which ones matter the most. I don't think that people would do better in that system at all. It's better just to focus people on one issue at a time as much as you can.
Right. I think there's a lot of ideas that we could talk about, like liquid democracy, that would help us solve the decomposition problem. Although I won't get into it right now. Maybe we'll make that as a topic for a future video. Is there anything else you want to say about this, Econoboy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this is definitely the weirdest policy of the bunch that they've It's like the most like not obvious that they would recommend this. But again, if you think about it, like, I guess if you think about it, it's almost, again, trying to take, radical markets. It's trying to take this sort of market allocation process and try to assume that it would lead to better outcomes because if you think of voting now as essentially a resource constraint and you think of that as a way to sort of optimally allocate votes, well, it might make sense. But what we're essentially saying is that it seems like quite a leap in assumptions to assume that this would essentially behave like a market in terms of like efficiently allocating like policy preference. It's just not clear basically that you'd want to design a democracy like a market for a number of sort of egalitarian and consequential reasons. Can
I just one reason for that is that unlike markets, there's only one good. This is a weird way of putting it, but in a market, I buy a broccoli and Micah buys like a bunch of green beans, apparently like just infinite amounts of them over three Thanksgivings. And then, we each buy individual products. There's a large number of products and we can buy an individual amount of them. In democracy, there is like one product. It's like the political power that is being controlled each election, and everyone votes together and their votes decide which product you get for the next 2-4 years. You can't subdivide it. And so the idea that this can work like a market process just doesn't make sense when it's a non-divisible single good. It cannot be a market.
That's a great point. It's like I wanted the green beans and I got it, but I also get the broccoli that SDL wanted, right? And I also get the carrots that Econoboy wanted.
It's like you put them all in one package.
Right. So, okay. I don't think this is the weirdest idea. I want us to move on to the third idea, which I think is really quite strange. This is about the Visas Between Individuals program, the VIP program. They have cute acronyms for all these ideas. They want to find a way to make immigration popular because they are liberals, so they love immigration. And their idea is that they would give every single citizen in the country the ability to sponsor an immigrant or possibly immigrants. And basically, sponsoring an immigrant would be allowing them to come into our country. We give them a visa, right? You have the power to bestow a visa upon a foreigner. And in exchange, you get to claim 50% of their wages for a certain period of time, maybe forever. I'm actually not clear because I haven't read the entire book. 50% is quite high. It's also interesting that you would be able to claim it specifically, because it seems that only a certain, like a smaller portion of the population would take advantage of this ability. And also the entire arbitration system of individuals having to scope out who they're in other countries, is there going to be like an app, like a dating app? Find who my sponsor, like, ooh, who will I?
Oh, Big Borders is censoring Micah.
Yeah, Micah, I think Micah describes this pretty accurately. It really is. I even saw in the lecture that the guy gave on this book, he's like, well, people call this indentured servitude, but it's not. It's not. And it's like, dude, I don't know how. This is literally just indentured servitude. Like almost like textbook definition.
It's only 50% indentured servitude. Thank you very much.
like how the fuck is this not indentured servitude? Like, and I don't know. I think how do I put this? Like, because if you think about it in some regards, like we do allow employers to do this. Like employers sponsor people to come over and provide work product. The difference, obviously, is that the employer isn't negotiating like a discount in their wages in order to do that. Like they're still paid a reasonably market determined rate and they get their full income. But obviously they just assume some of the sort of bureaucratic responsibility for filing paperwork and for maintaining their visa status, which is why it's difficult to obtain an employer visa because it's costly to the employer. But yeah, it just sounds bizarre and inequitable to basically allow, like, I mean, if you think about like what human trafficking looks like in an actually actually existing human trafficking, a lot of what it looks like is kind of something like this, where like people will come over and they'll say like, oh, we're going to give you a good employment opportunity. You're going to come over here, you're going to work, and you're going to make a lot of money. You're making American dollars. You'll be able to support your family at home and live here. But then what ends up happening is they take so much of that person's paycheck. Like you bring a bunch of like, Hispanic women to work as cleaners or something. And then you end up taking so much of their paycheck that they live in poverty in America. Sure, they're able to send USD back to their families at home and make them better off. But it's just clearly an abusive, like toxic situation relative to just letting them come in and work freely as autonomous people. And so I don't know. I do find this to be very difficult to defend from first principles and from any sort of like practical application.
Well, and just I think that sometimes in listening to people who really like this book, I've seen this defended as making immigration more politically feasible. Because wouldn't you support immigration if the immigrants were literally paying you money to live here? Wouldn't that make you love immigration? It's like, no, I think this individual setup would make everyone think that people who like immigrants want slaves. Like, I think it would make immigration like this unbelievably toxic thing. Like, oh, you love immigration? I guess you want to have a slave in your house paying you 50% of your income then. You piece of shit sloth do nothing.
Right.
And like, bluntly.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's weird. I mean, I imagine actually we have more immigration under this system. And I think the Steelman argument for them is by having individuals allocate the visas, there's no cap. And people always have a financial incentive to bring in more. And so people directly realize the wealth potential. And you could just see like a ton of people just saying, oh, visa to you, visa to you, visa to you, becoming like a billionaire just on letting as many people come into our country as possible. But 50% is an extraordinarily high rate. And
well, do they, Micah, do they talk about the liability side? Because presumably you would also have almost like a liability, like if this person comes into this country and like, robs a bank or something like that, like presumably you would be responsible. Otherwise, yeah, like
I don't think so.
Well, then, I don't understand. Like, if you're, because it's almost like moral hazard at this point. Like, why wouldn't I just say, like, oh yeah, I'm just going to sponsor 1 billion people to come in, and then I'll get like 1% of all their wages, and then.
So there might be just a cap of 1, like that everybody has of people they can sponsor. Presumably maximize, if there's a cap on the amount of people you can sponsor, then maximizing your earning potential would require you to allocate it to 1. But this undercuts the very point of having individual sponsor people in the first place, because the idea is, they'll sponsor more people than the government would. I think that I'll give them credit for this. I think many ideas in this book are not good themselves, but they provoke maybe better ideas. So like, I think imposing a special tax on immigrants isn't the worst idea in the world. I think that saying, hey, for every immigrant we let in, we're going to impose a 5% tax on them that's extra, and we're going to use that for direct dividend payouts to everybody in the country. The immigration bonus. Do I think that is optimal? No. But I do think it would directly help people understand that immigrants absolutely are net contributors to our society, and they would feel it.
It would also make it to be like, it would be like, what have immigrants done for you? Oh, it's 5% of my income. Like, that's what they've done for me. I basically agree with Micah. I think, movement is basically a human right. There's no reason you should restrict it. Workers are best off when they're most mobile. And there's huge benefits to global income of letting people move where they please. If it's necessary politically to do something like this, like if I have to do this to get 80% of the benefits of immigration, but like make people not vote for fascists, I'd do it in a heartbeat. It's just not clear that I don't think the visa auctioning system they're suggesting does that at all. Like, in fact, what Mike is suggesting, I think the reason it's different is that it's universal. It's that every immigrant pays in. There's no tie. There's no like potential for human trafficking. In fact, there's no ties whatsoever between you as an individual and you as an immigrant, but every immigrant pays in and everyone in the country benefits. And it's that sort of solidarity that might incline people to be like, oh, I benefit from this. I'm getting, on my UBI pay stub each month or whatever, I get like, here's my basic UBI pay stub from the Social Wealth Fund, the MICA Social Wealth Fund, and here's my pay stub from the immigrants. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
right. And I think the distribution of this is very different, right? Because we'd imagine if people could allocate a maximum number of visas, not only do you have this human trafficking aspect, not only could you like threaten to revoke their visa if they don't do what you want, which is completely scary, but also you just imagine that richer people would be the ones who take advantage of this, and the lowest income Americans, the ones who don't really understand how the system works or don't have the wherewithal to take advantage of it, won't receive any financial benefits, which is just really strange, right? Because they're the ones who tend to have the biggest anti-immigration sentiments in the first place.
Well, and potentially the biggest impacts of immigration are towards like the workers essentially who are being displaced. Like, if there's any negative effect to immigration, it's probably close to 0. But if there is a negative effect, it's largely on the people that the worker that's coming into the country is displacing or performing services similar to. So if you take in a bunch of high-skilled workers, which this visa system might encourage because you want to maximize your income, so you want to get as high-income people as possible, well, the people hurt by that are going to be like high-income tech workers. And if you take in a bunch of people from like Mexico, because they're easy to get across the border, well, again, you're going to be displacing a lot of people like that. But the people you're going to be benefiting are the same people who benefit from immigration currently, like the firms that employ them at lower wages. So it's like this seems to recreate almost all of the difficulties of the current system, but like slightly worse, I think.
I think I guess like I would I don't know. So it's technically the same because means tests are taxes and whatnot. But I guess like I would probably favor some sort of like, I don't know, because I'm very concerned with like punitive measures against immigrants, like very explicitly punitive things, like, oh, we're going to charge you extra taxes if you're an immigrant or from an immigrant background. But like the idea, like for instance, what seems to be more reasonable to a lot of people is the idea that if you're an immigrant, you don't have access to certain kinds of public services or like welfare benefits. And that seems intuitive to most people. Like the idea that if you come here, you can't just like immediately go on welfare because we would, in theory, only want you to come here if you're either you have some like incredibly compelling humanitarian case or you are a productive member of society. And so what might make more sense is just saying like, hey, like, basically American citizens get this sort of immigration determined UBI, like, hey, for every like immigrant that lives in America, we're going to give everyone like $1 a month or something. And then, of the UBI that you get every month, $20 of that is because of all the immigrants that live here. It's like, at least then you could point to something material to compensate. and then immigrants can just kind of live what they're already living, which is a life without as much access to welfare, but a life where they can live here and work and hopefully be productive.
Right. So what you're saying is we basically give them less welfare programs and we use that money for this purpose. I think that is practically the same idea, except it's not having a discriminatory tax system. I think politically it's a little bit harder for people to understand. Frankly, I think that what you have to do is you need to give people the most tangible access to the benefits of immigrants, because the problem is, even if you add more restrictions to your immigration system, you require everybody to learn English, everybody to be high skilled. You see in places like Canada, they already have a lot of those requirements, and you still get the bigotry. You still get the bad faith arguments about their effect on society, which is why I think some sort of direct payment to the population is so important. That's like obviously coming from immigrants.
Yeah.
Because I think it's the only way that people will tangibly accept their economic benefits.
It's difficult, though, because I think that in some regards, it feels like this is an insolvable problem of the human condition, because it does seem like throughout the hundreds of years of globalization and like immigration waves across all these different countries, it seems like literally there are, in terms of discrete moments, there are tens of thousands of examples of immigrant group is now an immigrant group in another country, and that other country that takes those immigrants just like hates them for a long period of time, and then just kind of gets over it, or there's some like mass expulsion, some like genocidal event that happens. And so I just, even like take America, a country filled with immigrants, like very, very robust immigrant heritage. In many respects, we're the best in the world at assimilating new immigrants. It's like, we still hate new immigrants that come here for some reason. So it's almost like an inherent problem of people that like, hey, those people, we just don't like them. It takes us a while.
I think there's a prejudicial, intuition that people have, but I think there's things you can do to reduce it. Like, I think that, at least in, Houston, we know a lot of people that don't speak English here. And, everybody's had like the teacher that doesn't speak very good English, or the server that doesn't speak very good English. And it's a frustration that people have, which I think might fuel this resentment. I've never felt this resentment. So frankly, I don't understand it completely.
I'm going to to be blunt, I think the resentment mostly just comes from racism. I do not think it comes from like lived experience. If anything, most of the research on contact theory seems to suggest that exposure to living with people from different backgrounds has like a slight negative effect on your bigotry. So like listening to the professor who has broken English, but then you learn all his life stories and his like wife with a disease and how he nursed her back to health. Like, yeah, you're like, oh, this is a mild inconvenience to my life, but he's a human being worthy of rights. Seems to be the main effect of it.
Right.
I genuinely think, in fact, there's evidence that places that got less immigrants voted more Trump. Like the exact as you'd predict from contact theory. So I genuinely think it mostly just comes from innate bigotry, or learned bigotry.
Like Mike has said, though, there's probably a more and less optimal way to align incentives, which is true, which is fair, right? Because I think in general, I would say that in times of really radical levels of inequality, I think that people are much more susceptible to looking for like a group to demonize, whether it's, you could say the rich, or you could say immigrants, or you could say landlords, or whatever it is. Like, it's like high inequality. What's the constituency group that leads to my relative level of poverty in the society? Well, it's X, Y, and Z. And so I think that in part is why, you don't see quite as much of a problem with integration in some areas versus others.
I mean, Scandinavia has tremendously equal society, and they have some, huge amounts of bigotry. I think it's largely,
well, yeah, but again, Mike, I'm not saying again, it's a multivariate thing, right? So obviously, like, yeah, Scandinavia, a very equitable society, but they have this sort of historically huge amount of immigration, which is of a type of immigration that's like radically different than they're used to. Like a Mexican coming to America has quite a number of communities that they can choose from that represent sort of roughly what they get in Mexico, because there's just so many Mexican immigrants. But a Somalian going to like Norway, it's like, what the fuck? Like, these are like totally wildly different people with a totally different historical trajectory. And so I can understand why that's a difficult problem. But in general, an equitable society is just one of those things that makes that problem a little less harsh overall.
I think it's probably true that greater, I would say more equitable, abundant housing, and probably tight labor markets are probably some of the keys to making. Let me put it like this: in as like a theoretical backing to some of this, we're talking about what are the reasons for xenophobia, and there's these sort of materialist reasons for it. Like it might be that you are materially hurt by people coming in, competing with you for jobs, whatever. Like we do know there's the evidence on employment and wages is that immigration is close to zero, but on housing the effect is pretty close to 1% more immigrants, 1% more expensive housing, right. Just like it is with population. Yeah, because guess what? They're people too. Like, yeah, they're deserving of rights, and people live in houses just like you. So it does raise prices if you're not building more houses. Like, no shit. But if you aren't building houses, then that does become a political problem because you're basically increasing population growth and you're giving a name and a foreign identity and other like bigotries you can use to oppose it. At the same time, I think like 80% of the reason is mostly on the social side. Something I like to mention a lot is that like when you look at white sub-ethnicities, they vote very differently. Like white people in the North are like 40, 50 points left of white people in the South. And they're like 30 points left of like white people in the Midwest. And I don't think that's just because of like material conditions or whatever. I think it does come down to partially like the ideology of the area, like the inculcation into beliefs that people have over time. Like religion is actually one of the biggest factors in all of this. So I do think it mostly comes from social beliefs that are like not super malleable to these kind of like, in other words, you can't just pay the problem away. You can pay away the 20%, but I think like 80% of it is just, yeah, a lot of rich people are bigots too. They've never been affected by immigration in any way negatively. They really hate people from another culture they see as destroying American culture.
Right.
So I just to, punctuate this topic, I'm going to give you the Micah Irfan pro tips to maximize immigration into your country while it's still being electorally possible and not disastrous for your political party. Number one, fix your supply side constraints so immigration does not increase costs for anybody. Fix your housing market, please. Make everything elastic so immigrants don't increase affordability concerns, and bigots use that as a talking point. Second, yes, have some sort of directly connected UBI so people have a direct financial stake in the benefits immigrants have for their country. Third, I think that language tests are appropriate. I think making people learn English, know a little bit about the country is not hard, especially in a country like the United States where there's so many people that want to come here and they're absolutely willing to learn. What you're trying to do is you're trying to minimize bigotry as much as you possibly can, and maximize assimilation and the economic benefits clarity to people so that you can avoid the kind of policies which are really bad, which is hard immigration. We already have that in this country. People want to lower that cap. In places like the UK, they're fighting for a zero net immigration cap. That's the stuff you want to avoid. So if you can put in place some measures that maybe are not completely optimal, but they reduce a little bit of the pressure towards going towards those really bad policies, I think it's worthwhile doing it. Okay, folks, on to the next bit.
Before we get off this one, something Econoboy said earlier is some of these ideas can spark better ideas. So they introduce, the Whale and Posner introduced this section by noting this idea of a visa auction. So rather than an individual being able to like buy a visa or whatever, it's just that the state would say, we're allowing 1 million people in this year. You can bid up the price of the auction as much as you please. And then the top bidders get to let someone into the country on that visa. Something I wanted to wonder is what if we had an uncapped auction where instead of setting the number, you set the base price? So let's say that it costs, like you had to pay the state $25,000 to let someone into this country, but anyone who wants to pay that can just buy a visa. Right. Like, would this not be like one of the other arguments around immigration is that it potentially could be bad to have high immigration during periods of economic downturn, but especially good in periods of economic upturn. Like you don't want to add extra labor when you don't need extra labor, but you do want to add extra labor when you're facing supply constraints. Is there some way to marketize immigration under this framework that would be better than, I don't know, whatever existing politically feasible situation you think is possible, Micah?
So that's entrance fee immigration, which is something that I've advocated for in the past, although it is extremely unintuitive for people get very upset, especially people on the left. My optimal system, I think politically, is a points-based immigration model where people can get certain points for having certain attributes, right? If you have a PhD or you're a business owner, you're going to get certain points. If you speak English, you get certain points. If you have a family member here, you get certain points. And you can also buy points, right? You can just make it very expensive, right? So, okay, if you pay $50,000, congratulations, you have enough points now. And I think this is a nice way of streamlining your system so that you can have the talking point. We're only letting people in that are net contributors. That's actually a lot of people, right? But I think that that's a very valuable framing for people, because people have this idea that we're letting in the worst of the worst. And I think that that's one of the things that leads them to be anti-immigration.
And the best part is
the only reason. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you take all that immigrant money that are buying their way in right into a sovereign wealth fund. Boom, dividend payment.
That's what I was wondering, is if you take the entrance fee and you plow that right into, like, here's the money on your pay stub or whatever, your UBI pay stub, is that a political winner?
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, I don't know if it's I feel like the first year that you implemented a policy like MICA is like, hey, you know, points-based immigration, you get 100 points if you give us $50,000, right? And you just get in automatically or whatever. I feel like that would raise like a pretty there'd be a lot of like upper middle income immigrants that would be like, oh, all I need to do to immigrate now is 50 grand. Here you go. First plane over. Like, you'd end up having a lot of like your upper middle income sort of like Nigerians and Turkish people and Chinese people, and like so many people that would come over and like get their sort of green card or whatever that
my
actually.
My understanding is we do have the system, but with a much higher level. It's something like if you own some level of property, I believe.
Yeah,
it's a golden visa program, and a lot of countries have this, but it's really convoluted,
and it's like super expensive. It's like way more than
$300,000 worth of real estate or whatever, which is actually really bad because that actually fuels the housing.
Yeah. Well, that's what so sucks about it, right? Is that like it's not equitable, it's not available to the poor, and it spurs all these like disinvestments where you're just buying something to get an immigration visa. Like, just make it cash, just financialize it, and just give it back to people and put it into aggregate demand. And it seems fine.
and money could also be, you know, you could have partial points with money. Like, let's say that, you know, like under MICA's system, like you could have like, I don't know, let's say that
this is an example where the quadratic voting would make sense. Like, each $10,000 gets you like a tenth of the previous point. So the first 10 is 1 point. You get like half of that for the next, half and half and half and half.
That's actually pretty interesting. So you know, there'd still be an incentive to learn English or something like that.
Yeah, so then, like, Prigozhin or whatever, he wants to get in, but he's got to pay $100 million because he's got the minus 10 points from war criminal, minus 10 points from sanctioned individual, but he can still get it. It's just very expensive.
like you could imagine a scenario where, like, oh, you know, I don't know English very well, but I am highly educated, and like, I don't know, like, I'm not bringing over any dependents, so like I'm just about at the line where I can qualify for a visa to America. And because I'm just at that line, I only need like an extra $5,000 instead of 50 to like top myself up and actually get a visa. Again, it would actually, I think, end up raising a lot of money. And like you said, like it would more cleanly be like, look, these people are here because they have money, right? Like they have, you know, skills or money or some combination of characteristics that we like know we would want.
Very last note, just rhetorically, when you talk to anti-immigration people, a word that comes up over and over and over is importing. The U.S. is importing these immigrants, when in reality, they're people that are freely traveling here on their own dime because they desperately want to live here. And I think that if you were like, no, they're actually literally paying you to be here, that would be a big rebuttal to that, even though I would hate it. Like, I just want open borders, but if it's what it takes to sell it, I'll like, get me the goddamn sign and I'll spin it.
Yeah, I mean, you live in a democracy. You have to deal with people's preferences, right? Yeah. And so if something is like untenable to the population, that's just something that we're not going to be able to do. And I think that this actually might be a little bit of a better idea than charging people an extra tax. There's probably constitutional concerns with that, but also there's this issue of timing. You know, if you charge people a 5% tax for 10 years immigrating here, people are benefiting from previous immigration levels, even if you close the border today. Mm-hmm. If you tie people's checks to entrance fees, that means you need to be letting people in all the time to keep those checks up. So there's more of a direct tie to current immigration levels. So I think this points-based idea, this synthesis of multiple different ideas, is probably the best that we could do. Okay, let's go on to the next topic in the book. SDL, what is it?
Oh God, I don't actually know thematically where we are in the book. Remind me.
What other topics have we not covered? I don't have any.
We haven't covered.
There's like 3 others.
We haven't covered the data as labor portion. Well, I guess I can explain this as best as I can. So, They kind of, the authors of this book, they kind of, and I don't know what the actual reason is that they think this is so important. But for some reason, they really focus on, as part of their planks, is like maybe in this information age. And I think one of the reasons that the authors said was that, like, oh, well, we assume that this will become more and more of a problem as things like AI really start to kick off and this sort of technological advancement starts to really accelerate, that this will become more and more of an issue, quote unquote. And I think that part of it as well is it's an attempt to sort of collapse the rents associated with AI and sort of data sorting and algorithms and stuff like this. But essentially what they say is we need to create a mindset and create a policy in this country where you get paid for the data that you essentially provide to these technology companies that they use to train AI and that they use to build better algorithms. For instance, like when I go on to the computer and like, I don't know, like I watch a video on like, what's it called? Like I watch like primitive technology, like build a mud hut or some shit. And then all of a sudden I get served advertisements about, camping and things like that. It's like, well, that's data that I'm essentially giving away for free so that they can advertise more effectively to a consumer base. And they basically say in this book, they say, well, this is labor that should be compensated in some way, and that is a kind of an important thing. During the 2020 election, I don't know, the more that the more that I think about it, like, I don't know if Andrew Yang had like read this book or something. I think that this book came out maybe 6 or 7 years ago. So it would have been like right around the time that Yang
2018.
Yeah, it would have been like right around the time that Yang started really like becoming a prominent presidential candidate. But I remember that was one of the things that I think Andrew Yang said was he's like, yeah, you should get paid for the data that you essentially give to these platforms for free, because it's how they, it's one of the things that they base their returns off of, obviously, is this sort of free data scraping that they get because they're the owners of these platforms. I guess my overall thoughts on this, I don't really have very strong thoughts. I think that one of the things that actually, in a Google talk that the author gave, one of the guys that was there interviewing him, he kind of pushed back because I guess maybe he worked for Google or something, because it was a Google talk. And he said, well, like, if you think about it, like the total amount of revenue that these companies make, if you were just to divide that by the consumer base, it's really just like not a very large payment. Like, it's just not a lot of money. Like if you were to say like, oh yeah, no, like for some like really autistic reason, like we just have to give people $3 a year for their data that they contribute to like all of these collective social media platforms. It's like, okay. I mean, I don't, does it make that big of a difference? Yeah. Anyway, right. What do you guys think?
It's not a big deal. I think it's like, it sounds nice. Oh, pay people for their data. But there's also consequences of that. First, like, how do you value it? How do you force tech companies to pay for it? What counts as the data that you're accumulating? And also, whenever you charge a price for something, well, people consume less of it, right? This is basic economics. When data is free, they're going to demand a lot of it. If you start charging companies to use it, they're going to consume less of it. And insofar that we think that this data actually has positive externalities in terms of the innovation that it generates in the user experience, that them consuming less of it is bad, but also it's problematic in the respect that it would reduce the revenue. So we're saying something like $3, generously. We're taking all of Facebook's revenue, we're taking all of Amazon's revenue, and we're just dividing it amongst everybody, or all their profits. But, well, if you're charging them for data, they're going to actually have a lot less data that they're consuming, probably, which means that it might just be $1.50. So I think it's a strange idea.
I think especially because like some of these things, I just don't know the social value of them. Like, for instance, like I think I would favor just like getting rid of sorting algorithms before I would say compensate people for the data they provide to sorting algorithms for various reasons. And I think as well, it's like, hey, if we think, because one of the things that the author stresses, like, oh, well, like one thing that he might say, oh, well, it's $3 now. But again, like once it really starts to take off, like maybe this represents, $100 a year potentially that we could give people. It's like, well, yeah, but just socialize capital, right? Just socialize part of capital. Like you don't need to have this sort of intricate corporate based payment that you give people, on some mandatory basis. It's just like, just take like 20% of the capital in this industry, throw it into a fund. Everyone gets a dividend check. To me, that's just a better way to do. Like if you're concerned about like the equitable nature of the return of these companies, just do that, right? It doesn't make sense to do this weird sort of internal payment, corporate-based payment, and like Micah said, it has all these problems as well, like with a valuation and distribution. I mean, why would you do it that way?
No, you can totally just end run it just by doing a social wealth fund and just distributing funds to everyone. And like you could argue that maybe some people contribute more data and they're not being fairly compensated for that. One of the reasons I really dislike this idea is that I've argued in previous episodes that I think that intellectual production should be as close to decommodified and free as possible. One of, I think, the upsides of stuff like social media is that everyone sort of just posts stuff that's available for everyone for free. Like, yeah, we're like you, viewer, we are producing content for you right now, and you are probably not subscribed to our Patreon and probably not paying us for this, but we're still doing it. And I think that's like kind of beautiful and good in the sense that like everyone has access to so much unbelievable information, like so much information, unbelievably more so than a previous generation. That feels like a good thing. I don't want to penalize or disincentivize that at all. But if you cost companies to take data from users, there will be a lot less of that production. Like if YouTube now has to pay a cost for every video that we produce, for every time that like someone clicks on a link in the side chat, in like the recommended feed, they click on something, oh, well, they've used your data, now they owe you 1 cent. Well, then there's just going to be a lot less of that content. So I am worried actually that this would effectively function as a tax on the production of social media insofar as that is useful. And a lot of social media is garbage, as we've talked about previously, but that's largely not because of like the user data is being misused. It's because the algorithms behind the content are garbage and promote clickbait. Like this is targeting the wrong issue, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think especially, because then you get into like, if you should be compensated like proportionally to your internet use, it's like, well, I don't know if that's something we would want to encourage necessarily. And then, it's and then again, it just has these egalitarian concerns of like, well, the more egalitarian way would be
tweeting 10,000 times a day so I can get my $1 check or whatever.
Yeah, like
those RuneScape farms where like people in like the Philippines or something will spend all day mining gold, so some rich kid in America will like swipe mommy's credit card and get a fully maxed out account. You're gonna have that for goddamn tweets. Like some guy is just tweeting 24/7 in the Philippines just to get $1 a day. Like,
you got like kids in like Eritrea on like flip phones, just scrolling through Amazon all day for like $1 a day just to try and like mine an extra check. Yeah, it just I don't know. Anyway, yeah, and then again, like the more equitable way to do it would just be a horizontal payment anyway, which again is detached somewhat from the production of internet. But I think that, to me at least, I think of a lot of the problems of like the internet and technology not as sort of a problem with how profits are distributed, but rather almost like a social externality that like, the demand for clickbait is bad. We shouldn't encourage clickbait at all, even if it's profit maximizing. The self-image problems that so many young people have nowadays because of social media access, like that's bad. And like children shouldn't access social media, even though it's profit maximizing. There's just a lot of things about like the nature of social media and algorithms and data mining as a business that probably should just be heavily regulated and not necessarily sort of distributed from a profit maximizing perspective.
Right. I think it's a really good point. I think it relates to behavioral economics. People don't always make the best decision for themselves. Sometimes people's preferences are just bad for themselves, which maybe isn't a typical economics idea, but it seems like it's very much true in the case of social media, and that's the big problem that we have to try to solve. Now, let's touch on the last topic, I believe, in this book, which relates to some ideas on antitrust. Mm-hmm. The authors argue that institutional investors, investment funds, banks, owning shares in multiple competing companies in one industry causes problematic incentives. Because ideally, the companies are trying to outdo one another and maximize their profits that way. But if you own shares in both, and very significant shares, perhaps you actually don't want United Airlines to really beat Delta, because that actually cuts into your profit margin. So they want to ban that cross investment. Think about this idea.
I think overall
real quick, I have a quote from the book on their exact proposal, which is, quote, "No investor holding shares of more than a single effective firm in an oligopoly and participating in corporate governance." So they have this sort of two-stage thing. You can only own shares in one firm unless you're a truly passive investor, in which case you can own as much as you want. But if you want to manage firms, to continue the quote, may own more than 1% of the market. So if you want to be if you want to own stuff in airlines and you're BlackRock or whatever, and you want to actively manage those firms, you can own 20% of BlackRock and nothing else, or you can own 1% of everything and that's it. Those are your options. So that's just to summarize their proposal.
Yeah, I think I have mixed feelings about this proposal overall. Like my big sort of structural criticisms for Matt Brunig's model is what Matt Brunig will say is he'll say, well, actually, at the point of socializing all of capital, which is to say that like the public owns all capital, like every airline company, every like grocery store, whatever, all these kind of different companies, you're actually incentivized as the universal owner to perfectly efficiently administer all of those companies, because why would you want like a worse performing airline in your portfolio when it's part of your portfolio? Like you want the best airlines always. And if we think that competitive dynamics exist, you still want them to compete very vigorously. The issue with this, obviously, is that practically speaking, that just doesn't seem to be what happens when the government socializes a really large percentage of capital. Like, it seems like, in part, the motivation for socialization of capital is political in nature, and so you end up with overinvestment problems. Now, what the radical markets people are doing, they're basically making the same criticism, but substantially more decentrally, let's say. They're saying, hey, when BlackRock owns 3% of like JetBlue and also 3% of like United Airlines, that has the same sort of problems as what I'm describing with the universal socialist owner. And it's very not clear to me that this is actually a problem. I guess that's like one of my foundational criticisms of this, is that it's a solution in search of a problem. I don't really see the problem with like the competitive dynamic when you have like BlackRock and Vanguard who each own 3% of various major airlines. Like, they don't own large percentages of it. Corporate consolidation isn't that crazy. And stock, although heavily concentrated in the top 10%, is still highly decentrally owned. And so I just don't really know how big of a problem this actually is essentially my main criticism.
Right,
well,
right.
Sorry.
You can imagine, let's just talk about a specific situation in which this could be a problem. Imagine you have a big institutional investor, which owns, as I said earlier, a big part of United and a big part of Spirit Airlines. Does Spirit still exist? Or are they gone?
It does.
Did they merge with somebody?
Exist. I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Okay, Lena Khan protected Spirit Airlines. I think somebody was trying to acquire them. I don't know what the story is there. Okay, so let's say the most profit maximizing thing for United to do is to break into the low-cost airline space, which would come at the cost of revenue from Spirit. But it also has this other option, which is breaking more into luxury travel, which would hurt other airlines and it wouldn't hurt Spirit. So because you're an institutional investor and you own part of Spirit and United, you might actually prefer United breaking into the luxury market rather than the cheaper market, even though the most efficient profit maximizing decision for them to do is breaking into the cheaper market. And if you accumulate these inefficient decisions economy-wide, you could have a bunch of inefficient behaviors from companies. I think, as Econoboy says, this doesn't seem like a really big problem. Maybe we can touch on some of the problems our financial markets actually do have, but I don't think this is really a big one of them.
Well, just on the airline market in particular, Matt Brunig in particular cites two studies. One which finds that institutional investment slightly lowers productivity, and one which finds that it slightly raises it. So like it's possible the empirical research will shift, and it's going to be like all finding in 10 years, we're going to have 80% of the papers are going to show negative effect on productivity. When I looked into this, it seems closer to null, the effect of institutional investors. And Brunig raises this interesting argument. If you are a universal owner, you aren't just thinking about the one sector, but you're also thinking about downstream effects. So the case that Whale and Posner raise is, let's imagine that you own like all the airlines. So like you're just the owner of all the airlines. Well, you'd want to raise prices in airlines, right? Because you get more profit out of it, and you're effectively acting like a monopolist. You can raise prices, but because you own so much of the market, it's really hard for people to break in. So you're going to be able to raise it quite a bit without people being able to leave the market. Okay, but what if you own other sectors, like say tourism sector? Well, then you don't want to raise airline prices because then less people go to tourism. So you actually have an incentive to want prices lower for everything because it makes the entirety of your assets do better. If you own everything up and down the entire like supply pipeline, you don't want to raise prices in randomly one part of the pipeline. You want everything as low as possible to maximize output. Or so goes the argument. It's possible that this does change, like you hit 50% or something control, and the incentives start to change. It is possible that really, really, really big institutional investors, like a potential social wealth fund or a potential mega BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, that could be bad. It's just not clear that we're at that point. And it's also not clear, just to be like it's an argument on social wealth funds, that we'd ever even need to hit that. You could imagine that you just split up multiple institutional investors and force them to compete against each other, and you never hit that like 50% point.
I think there's also another valuable point to make here, which is there's a big difference between what is the optimal, most rational behavior to take on and the behavior actually people take on. Right. There's, if you have a one common owner which owns everything, it might be most efficient and profit maximizing for them to maximize the efficiency of every single sector. But there's also no competitive pressures on them to do that. And so, yeah, they might be giving up some profit by taking on some inefficient behaviors, but there's no fire, under their ass, right? There's nothing forcing them to do that. And they might be a satisficer where they're okay getting the 7% profit margin instead of the 15% profit margin from optimal behavior. And so that's another area where I think classical assumptions can lead us a little bit astray. Now, something I do want to say here is, I think an actual problem in financial markets is what we call commonization. People are buying index funds all the time. What is an index fund, y'all? Can y'all explain that?
It's a pool of stocks that represents some fundamental aspect.
Right. So I realized I was not a great investor whenever I bought Alibaba at $120 and now it's at $85. And so I gave up on buying stocks. I realized in fact, I was not Warren Buffett. I was Mike Irfan. And so I started buying into the entire stock market, an index which gives me a tiny slice of everything that exists. And it gives it in proportion to the current market value or the weighting of the market value in the stock market. So Apple is the most valued stock. So 1% of my dollars went to Apple. And then a really small tech company maybe is 0.0001% of the stock market. So 0.001% of my money goes to that. And what this kind of index fund investing does, which is very common these days, is basically reinstantiate or strengthen the instantiation of the current weighting of stock values. And basically, the existing distribution of stock market caps is strengthened by people investing this way. And we find that the companies that are currently very valued very well, like Apple, benefit from it, and smaller companies don't benefit from it. And so this can lead to a misallocation of capital and ultimately a less competitive economy over time. And so the reason people do this is because the expected rate of return from investing in index funds is the average market rate of return. That's compared to actively invested funds that you can put your money in, mutual funds. Your grandparents probably have some. Those, on average, make the average rate of return. But wait, they have management fees, right? And so because they have management fees, the average rate of return from an actively managed fund is going to be lower than just the average rate of return, because there's these fees you have to take into account, which gives index funds a competitive advantage. And so this is a problem because it's leading to a lot of people investing in index funds, which can have this allocative efficiency issue. And so I think a good argument could be made for imposing a special tax on index funds because they have this negative externality of maybe like 1%, so that more people choose to give money to active investors, which might make more rational decisions than just doubling down on current stock valuations.
Yeah, and I think what's important to keep in mind here as well is that you can have actively managed wealth that is still a diversified portfolio. So I think that some people, especially nowadays, because when people want like a diversified portfolio, they'll just invest in sort of index funds and things like this. But what you have to keep in mind is that the way that you would do that back in the day before ETFs and passively traded index funds became so positive is you would invest in mutual funds, and you still can do that. And the only difference between like an ETF and a mutual fund, practically speaking, is that mutual funds are typically actively managed. And you just end up with a slightly higher management fee, yes, but you end up with sort of allocative efficiency, which hopefully, or at least like relatively speaking, allocative efficiency to just putting all your money in a passive fund.
Is there good evidence that that the index fund or like commonification, I believe you called it, strategy has allocative efficiency effects?
So here's the one piece of evidence which is undeniable, and then there's disputes about how much this matters. When you add a stock to an index, that stock starts to move with the index, which means that indexification actually does affect stock prices. The efficient market folks will say that actually no, active investors completely compensate to make everything equally efficient otherwise. Now we know indexification is just doubling down on existing distributions, which is not rational, right? Sure. So you're saying, okay, well, if you assume that active investors are somewhat rational, and now you're making active investors have less power and indexes have more power, then you're necessarily making capital allocation less rational, which presumably makes things less efficient.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of to the degree to which this is a problem. Like, because some people will say, like Michael Berry, you know, he's one of the big short guys. Like this has been his big thing for like the last 10 years, is he's saying, oh, this is a huge problem. It's going to be a bubble just like 2008, and everyone's investing in things that are fundamentally have no value at all. And it's like, well, I don't know. It seems like the S&P 500 companies, like, there's a lot of fundamental value here. Like, I don't think this is a bubble in the same sense that people are investing in something that's just like so terribly underwater that they don't realize it. But to Micah's point, it certainly seems that it's the case that there's probably some marginal inefficiency associated with this. So having something like a tax on passive investing to sort of equalize the management fee cost versus tax cost, to where you might be indifferent between the two, like that probably makes some sense. I mean, plus SDL also, you get to tax capital a little bit more. That's always nice.
I just wouldn't another option here just be that you could force these into, like, if you forced more savings through Social Security or something along those lines, and then you use those savings to set up active management, but maybe benefiting from more scale, would that be able to avoid, like, is there a systematic relationship between management fees and scale of investment in such a way that you could attempt to avoid this by like having many large firms which are actively investing and sort of take over the assets invested in index funds? Yeah. But for the individual investor, it's like you've pooled it over all of those active investment. So you're still doing commodification, but it's like commodification over active investment of that funds. I don't know if that's
I think the optimal stock market is where there is like a bunch of hyper intelligent people, not just one, but like a bunch of hyper intelligent people doing capital allocation. So you can still have market pricing and this decentralized information system. The current system is large part indexes, some smart money, and then a bunch of dumb money too, like us buying stocks, right? Yeah, and so I think that, something like, private accounts, private savings accounts that are auto invested in bonds, but you're like pushed, like in Sweden, you are urged to put it in sort of some active mutual fund. And there's like a couple that are maybe selected by the government based on their performance. Maybe there's some algorithm.
The question I was sort of trying to ask is, what if there was a way to buy into common ownership of all of the active investment? Like, so the problem is you're buying into active investment of all the stocks. And the problem is that sets the current like share in constancy. Well, maybe it's less bad if you do the second order thing. You're setting in the current share of active investors. Like, it makes it harder for them to grow or fall, but they're still actively investing on the stock market, which means that like the allocated inefficiency was shifted like one level up to a smaller submarket.
Right, because presumably, I mean, what like the argument against this is, well, now you have less of an incentive to, invest efficiently. But, presumably your managers of these funds yes, they benefit when more capital comes into their fund, right? That's obviously an incentive. But they also are like directly have options and like directly, like their compensation is directly tied to financial management, right? So maybe instead of like doing well, it gets you $10 million instead of $35 million, but they still have an adequate incentive. So actually, I think that's a decent idea. You could waive the fee on a mutual
big dumb money. Please repeat.
I mean, that's what
you could waive the fee, the special index fund penalty fee on an index fund of mutual funds or of active investors.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, like, you could also, like, sovereign wealth funds can be actively managed as well. I don't know how, Alaska runs theirs, but Norway's fund is actively managed.
Well, that's sort of the suggestion that I was trying to raise. Like, imagine the state gets, it gets $1 trillion in Social Security funding each year. And one way you could avoid the sort of problem you're raising, Micah, is rather than funding current asset management money, you just spin up 10 new companies every year or whatever. You like subdivide the current intake. Here are the new companies, rise or fail as you please. You're managing our money now. And you're just constantly spinning them up. But you as a citizen have an ownership stake in like the results of all of those firms until they die.
Right. I want to respond to one of our commenters because they're going to bring up a point which other people might think about. They said that basically on mutual funds and active management just does worse than index funds over the long run. And I know what they're citing. There's a lot of studies which show that like 90% of active investors underperform the index over time. Now, the reason why this happens is because of the asymmetry of winners and losers in financial markets. There's some companies like, Microsoft, Zoom, or whatever that do extremely well. And then there's everybody else, which does a little bit less well, right? So the average rate of return is skewed by these huge overperformers and tons of minor underperformers. So on average, if you're just allocating investment, on average, the median person is going to do worse than the index. But the index's rate of return is the average of all of the rates of return. So it is the average of active investors' rate of return. So there is some small subset of investors which become billionaires and make tons of crazy money. And so it would be impossible for index funds to outperform the average of active investors over time because those are necessarily a mathematical identity equal.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think just your basic portfolio theory, right? How can you combine sort of differently risky returns and end up with an optimal return based on, combining differently risky assets? I think that would lead you to, at least understanding that, actively managed funds versus passively managed funds wouldn't have sort of substantially aggregately different returns. And this is one of the things about Bruning's proposal, which I've never quite understood, is he'll very stubbornly say like this shouldn't be privately managed. The sovereign wealth fund should be managed by the state, and you shouldn't outsource this responsibility to private actors. And it's like, well, it just seems like we have sufficient reason to believe that a purely publicly managed investment fund probably wouldn't be as allocatively efficient as just outsourcing it and then paying some like very small management fee. Like again, when you're talking about a fund that's like it's just that when you're talking about a fund that literally would be bigger than like fucking BlackRock, Vanguard, like all these places combined, trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth, your management fee that you'd be paying would be trivially small. And I would recognize that the allocative efficiency gains that you would get would probably be relatively small as well, but it just seems like a more optimally designed system. So I don't know why that's such a stubborn thing from Bruning's proposal. Yeah, STL.
I know the thing that I sort of stubbornly stuck on is you could just have publicly run firms you could bargain it out to the privately run firms, but you could also just spin up new state-owned firms as well. If we take, I believe way earlier, if we take the evidence that state-run firms, which are run like a business, are essentially comparable to those of privately run firms, like just permanently appoint like Ron Paul, I don't know, he's kind of a crank, permanently appoint like Paul Ryan in charge of the state ownership management fund management board in Congress or whatever, just permanently put some Republican up there, and they're constantly getting mad about having to manage all these state-owned firms, but they'll run it like a business and it'll turn out fine. So just like give the immortal conservative power and it'll turn out okay.
I
think I'm gonna summarize my model real quick because we're delving into the only good form of socialism, Irfanism. Okay.
Oh my God.
The Irfanist approach. The difference between having a bunch of competing social wealth funds appointed by the government and my model is instead of having the government select who's a good investor, we have people self-select and then prove through a competitive market process that they are the best. Here's what happens. The government takes its social wealth fund money, let's say $1 trillion. It has an algorithm which automatically splits this up into a series of chunks. These chunks can be 1% of the total amount. They could be $500,000, inflation adjusted every single year. So the next year it's $502,000, but it's automatically split up. Then you put all of this money up for bid. People bid for the money. And what they say is, we are going to guarantee the public a certain rate of return on this money. That's the way they win the bid. So there's no government discretion in approving this. It's all completely automated. and they can only win a certain number of bids. The reason why they can only win a certain number of bids is because we don't want market concentration problems where one person wins all $1 trillion of investment capital, and we have BlackRock, which runs everything. And what happens is you have completely decentralized investment. There's no argument against this from an allocative efficiency point of view. Actually, this probably would lead to more allocative efficiency than we currently have. And we have maximally high returns for the public. And you could scale this up to eventually own all capital while having decentralization. The perfect neoclassical hypermarket version of 100% socialized wealth. Literally no arguments against it, and none of the problems.
And to be fair, the argument I offered is just take those firms and now make them state-owned. Done. Like you've closed the loop.
Now the government hires. Now the government hires who's in charge, and they have to fission their funds all the time, and you have to have a government monopolistic HR manager.
You clone Paul Ryan again, and he becomes the next manager, the immortal conservative number 2, and he's in charge of all these management firms.
Right. Let's give a monopoly on the HR of hiring the investment managers. Why don't we have markets for that too? That doesn't sound very socialist to me.
I mean, we did talk about, we're getting a little far from the radical markets book. Okay. But sorry, we're going back to old conversation.
This is our version of radical markets, okay? Radical Irfanism.
No. Well, so let's why don't we go through the 5 proposals? I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to cover before like sort of summary, Micah.
Yeah, let's wrap it up good. And then we can go on to the Patreon topic after this.
So just to go through the 5 ideas in the book, by one, is that first is this idea that property is monopoly and sort of just a generic support for Georgism, which I think we all agree with, and suggestion of the self-assessed wealth tax on all assets is their first major proposal.
I give it a
thumbs down.
I give it a 5 out of 10. Just all right.
I feel like the amount of paperwork I'd have to do to assess everything in my life would be so bad. When eventually we read participatory economics, I feel like weirdly there's going to be a parallel between the amount of pre-planning you have to do in participatory economics for Michael Albert and the amount of self-assessment of all the shoes in my house I'd have to do for.
You will evaluate the value of your toothbrush. You will pay the 7% tax on it, and you will be happy.
I won't own it when like BlackRock comes in and buys all the toothbrush stock away from me, and I have to put it in the mailbox.
Yeah.
So, not a fan. What did we think for that one of modifications? Are there easy modifications which make it a 10 out of 10?
I think that you could apply this to things like the radio spectrum, which they even mention in some of the lectures where it works. But it is a broad and extreme application of an idea that's already existed, which is the Harberger tax, which I like to say, just like the rest of this book, perfect in spirit. Okay, I love the ethos. Terrible idea. Terrible idea.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just the compartmentalization of this. It's just it's difficult to it's difficult to envision. It almost runs up against like a fundamental like maybe just a limitation of our economic understanding, right? Because like Micah said at the very beginning, like, in some regards, does this create like hyper-competitive markets? Yes, right? It seems like almost necessarily it would. But at the same time, if we actually achieved sort of this perfect competition ideal, then that does seem like it would reduce the incentive to invest substantially, right? Now, some people would say, well, it reduces the incentive to invest until there is an incentive to invest again. And this is like the sort of cycle of, basically a cycle of economic production. But yeah, I don't know. It seems like you would want to compartmentalize this substantially.
And just for myself, it seems like a perfect idea for property, which is almost a monopoly already, like intellectual property, land, a lot of online, like internet domain related stuff. It doesn't seem to make sense for things which you can produce cheaply and easily on near competitive markets. Because the allocative efficiency gains would be small, but the additional transaction costs would be unbelievably huge, I think. So I'm not convinced for a universal thing. I think it's a very interesting application for a lot of really important markets like intellectual property, where allocative efficiency might be really, really, really low right now. So it might actually have a very large effect even in those sectors. And lands too.
Yeah, and even the authors concede that this is such like a radical conception of property that it would not be very likely to pass the muster of like a campaign. But obviously, I think that we would we would probably largely concede that with our own platforms, like our own ideal platforms as well.
Sure.
So that's hard to say, but
The
quadratic voting.
the mandatory lifelong college proposal will be getting 90% approval.
Yeah.
Proposal number 2 was quadratic voting. This one I think might be shorter. So rated out of 10.
I give it a 2 out of 10.
I give it a 6. I could be convinced that this is a good idea. I think at least it gives us this idea of compartmentalization, which we all agree should exist more in our democratic system. So I like that aspect at least.
Yeah, I'm kind of with Micah. I think it's nice in the sense that it might encourage compartmentalization, except I think its actual structure would be the opposite of that, in that it ties all issues together and forces you to weigh them all as one. Can you imagine how bad the voting discourse on Twitter would be when it's like, not only do you have to vote for Harris, I'm demanding you give her 50 points or else you're not a real Democrat? Like, you're not. Do you realize the threat to democracy by you not putting 75 points for Harris? The discourse would be unimaginably bad.
Yeah, like on STL's point, it just seems like there's a much stronger case for like epistocracy, like weighting votes based on knowledge than weighting votes based on intensity of the belief, because it just seems like it is very not clear to me, especially in our current discourse, that your intensity of your belief actually correlates with how much you know about a subject. That does not seem to be. Like, I'm sure there's some correlation, but it's very loose.
Well, and in some topics, I bet it's negative. Like, anecdotally, the people who have the strongest feelings on immigration are usually like the dumbest.
Right. Like Jason Brennan, the big epistocracy guy, like he'll come in and he'll say, like, actually the most intense, like the people who feel the most intensely about politics, they tend to be the least informed, because the most informed people tend to have, more moderate, like less strong opinions. And that's not entirely true, I don't think, but it's just like, look, if the problem that we're trying to solve here is we want to ensure that voting is rational and like that it would result in like the best possible outcomes, then quadratic voting just seems strictly less preferable to epistocracy. And epistocracy itself has a lot of structural criticisms that I think are reasonable. So
number 3 was the personal visa / well, I shouldn't call it indentured servitude before we rate it. What would we rate it out of 10? And would we call it indentured servitude?
I would definitely call it indentured servitude. I would give it a 1 out of 10. I think this is a rough idea to propose overall in our current system. But
yeah, I mean, I give it like a 4. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I could be convinced that this is better than the current system. Maybe if you staple it on, where it's just like, yeah, I guess, we get more immigration, but they're just like, their wages are just completely garnished. And, maybe the alternative was them being a really poor Haitian. So, the net impact on the world is good, but really, really not that great of an idea.
Yeah, I would say maybe like 2 out of 10, sort of like Micah. Like, it might be better than the alternative only because we live in a world of like extremely strict borders and really dumb racists, pretty much.
Yeah, it's another idea where it seems like there are strictly better alternatives. Like, if you're going to write a book on your ideal system, like Radical Markets is, it seems like, well, there's definitely better ways to do this than if you're just like imagining what the best system would be.
The most radical view here is the classic liberal one. It's like, oh, you're a human, you own the whole earth, property is monopoly. Why should one nation get to decide where you get to walk and where not? Okay, open borders now.
Right, and you could just also imagine that the politics of this is as good as they imagine, because everybody who isn't benefiting from it will probably just call this indentured servitude. Like, if Democrats do this, they're gonna call the Democrats slavers. And yeah, the people who benefit from it love it. It's going to be the majority of people, right? So I don't think the politics of this is as favorable as the authors imagine.
For sure.
Number 4 is destroying institutional investors as controlling entire sectors, large shares of entire sectors.
I could see this being like in a long term, like maybe 50 years from now, I'm like, oh, that's actually a 7 out of 10 idea, because maybe market concentration truly just becomes like such a big problem. But because of the sort of because these firms are typically biased towards diversification and like stability of cash flow, there's so many different competing interests. I mean, like you guys said, like if you just started extracting a ton of rents from like the airline industry, well, that's going to hurt your tourist stocks. And so it's just not clear that there's even a internal motivation to do such a thing. The capital required would be extraordinary. Like the reason that like Vanguard only owns like 0.5% of all these companies, it's because it's just really expensive to just it's both really expensive and a poor diversification portfolio management strategy to actually own that high a percentage. And we also have to keep in mind that when it says that Vanguard owns, 10% of a company, that's really just managed funds from like many fucking hundreds of thousands of different people and interest groups who have different sort of perspectives and like sort of marginal changes in how they want their money to be managed. And so it's just really not clear that this is a problem right now. So I'd give it a 2 out of 10. Very impractical currently.
You're kind of like giving very binary ratings. You're either like almost 0 or almost 10. Go ahead, Micah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'd give this like a 5. Like I'm not going to give a really low rating to anything I could see myself being convinced of. Like maybe there's some sort of empirical case here. I'm willing to wager this would be net negative because it does reduce aggregate investment. And I also think there's a definitional issue of saying, what industries really compete with one another, right? I think that you see like a lot of companies that are very large are kind of competing in a lot of different spaces, right? Like does the iPhone compete with cameras? I don't know. Like, am I allowed to own more than 1% of Apple and, Canon? That like, there's a good argument. I think like, introducing those definitional ambiguities is certainly a problem.
And just to speak to that, like doing those definitional debates is really hard for the DOJ, the FTC, and the third one, which I always forget. And they have teams of like trained lawyer economists who do nothing but that all the time, every day. So the idea that you'd have to do this as an additional burden for like the federal exchange management, it just seems like not necessary, not a huge benefit. I don't know. I guess I would put it like a 5% or something. I actually feel like the more interesting argument is just that like large institutional investment and large passive investment might be bad, which I think sort of like Econoboy said, might just be true, might be true. It's just not clear what the best ways of avoiding that are, other than some of the more radical proposals like Micah mentioned, for example, or just like, I don't know, antitrust, like, oh, BlackRock, you got too big, we're splitting you in half. Cope and seethe.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, a lot of this stuff is already illegal, right? Like, if BlackRock owned 2 major airlines and started making decisions on behalf of management that was literally meant to extract rent and, like, coordinate production between 2 companies that are ostensibly supposed to be competitors, that's already illegal. Like, that's already something that, in theory, would be gone after by our current antitrust policies. Like, if all of a sudden, U.S. Shell, Exxon, like they all started merging together to form one giant, big boy oil company, Inc., then that would probably be stopped by regulators for the same motivation.
The argument they're effectively giving is that this is trust by another name. That this is so like back in the day, U.S. Steel wasn't a single firm; it was like a trust of many firms. And they're trying to argue that BlackRock is doing the same thing by like, it owns all these firms. And if you're a CEO at the firm, well, you know that your firm and the other firm and the other firm and the other firm are all owned a little bit by BlackRock. And BlackRock will probably vote for higher compensation if you engage in slightly price collusive practices. So you're going to do slightly price collusive practices. And if they go along with it, you'll do a little bit more. And I could see all that happening. It just seems like that's all probably closer to marginal. And there's other major like in the monopoly and competition video, I think the problem probably relates more just to the firms themselves being really large and having weak competition in the first place. It's a lot harder to price collude with more competitors. So what if we just made more competitors? Maybe the institutionals don't matter anymore.
There's also these arguments about having a lot of ownership in one sector. There's externalities of innovation, which means you actually capture more of it by owning the competitors. Yes. And also like maybe BlackRock is voting against United getting into the low cost airline sector with its practices, but everyone else is voting for it, right? So like even if their voting behavior is being impacted by this, is it actually changing corporate decisions? I'm willing to wager not that often, probably not. Yeah.
Number 5 is the data as labor proposal, which I felt like we mostly just.
Terrible. I think this is 0.
I feel like if I had to look through these, I feel like cost and supply to the economy could be ruinous, or it could be a slight productivity gain. Like it's sort of a gamble. I feel like number 2, the radical democracy one, I'm not a fan, but it probably wouldn't also ruin democracy. I'd expect outcomes to actually be fairly close to right now, just because of how the voting is weighted. Like most people will be incentivized to basically pay 1 vote for each issue and not weight their votes very much. So it would seem like it would come out pretty close to the concert situation. for the visa system, I think that'd be like just horrible, like completely bad. And then finally for like the institutional investors, it feels like basically neutral. But this one is like another one that could be like completely horrible. Like the universal wealth taxation could be completely horrible. The visa system could be completely horrible as indentured servitude. And this one could just like destroy the internet as being able to function in any meaningful way. And I think that would probably, I don't know, maybe I should actually say this could be one of the uniquely good ones because it could destroy social media and then force everyone off social media, which might be a net social positive. So I don't know, maybe I should be more ambivalent about this one. But like this policy is so bad for the sector it's targeted at.
Yeah, I started writing an article about like media organization, and one of the arguments that I sort of discovered while writing was like this idea of, well, you know, if we had more like democratic health maximizing media production, that's not necessarily profit maximizing because you probably have some like less people watch like dense policy analysis. But then it's like, okay, but is less people watching TV a bad thing, right? So we're stuck between two potentially good outcomes, between like more people watching dense policy stuff and less people watching TV in general. Based, like both of those seem like potentially good outcomes. Anyway, so I feel similarly about the social media thing. It's like I think that it's probably a 1 out of 10 just because I don't think that like the $1 a year that people are going to be getting from this is really a meaningful amount of money. And it does seem to just create like a really large amount of administrative inefficiency. Again, it's like, why would we, if we think people should be compensated for the returns to capital associated with data, well, then again, I mean, it just makes more sense to just socialize part of capital and just like dividend out the rest to people. And that's probably significantly more administratively efficient, both on the government and the corporation's end.
And to speak to that conceptual link, it's so frustrating to me because they make that conceptual link with the Georgism bit. They basically make the link with the wealth tax. They're like, hey, everyone raises the value of land by living near it, right? The local amenities raise the value of land. But instead of being like, oh, if you walked near a value of land, then the guy who owns land has to parcel out like a penny to you for each time you walked nearby, raising its value. They're like, no, let's just socialize the damn thing and pay it out to everyone. Like, yeah, okay, if you do that, then let's just do that for everything. Like, there's so many things where you add value just by existing near something or interacting with something, but you're never like, and that's why you should pay a millionth of a penny in user fees. Like,
exactly.
Why?
The firm handshake that you give somebody in a transaction that must be compensated. That is something of value.
There is an interesting Georgist argument actually, which is, like your land value is contributed to by my development next door, which means that you actually should be forced to subsidize me. Which maybe actually that's optimally efficient. If I make my garden really nice and it increases your land value a little bit, maybe you should just be obligated by the state to compensate me for my work.
Well, it's just obviously a much more fair way to distribute the gains from development, right? That obviously if you're basically a free rider in that regard, like you're like the one guy who owns a plot of land in the middle of downtown, like there's clearly a lot of rent being extracted here. So you should probably pay a lot of tax to maintain that exclusive ownership.
And Micah, just to speak to the thing you mentioned, like the suggestion given for like the suggestion you gave is true of everyone. So why not just do this as a social thing? Like that's the argument I gave. Let's subsidize investment. Let's like fully expense like investment, do all the things you can to subsidize investment. You're just doing that on a non-user fee, non-individual basis. And you're right that it might not be like perfectly optimal for you subsidizing local development, but it's almost certainly administratively like a bajillion times easier. Just subsidize it everywhere for everyone, right?
So fun fact here right before we end. A elected official friend of mine saw a video of mine. I don't know if it was our video on this or a video I made with Rose Rich 2 years ago on land value tax. And he said, I'm actually fully land value tax billed. I didn't know Georgism was a thing, but this is really cool. Can you help me structure a bill to actually implement this? Mm-hmm. So there is a 4% chance that Maryland implements a special form of land value tax, which is levied on underdeveloped properties in suburban and urban areas. So like a special penalty on free riders and financial speculators. Full land value tax is not yet coming, okay? But we may get limited Georgism in the great state of Maryland.
There we go. Well,
our videos matter, folks.
That's right.
I think those are our general thoughts on Radical Markets. I think that Radical Markets as a book, it probably reinforces and adds to what is ultimately, I think, the best economic system is probably very pluralist and doesn't really quite fit into like a neat bucket of like Georgism, capitalism, socialism. It's probably a pretty wonky sort of ill-defined system overall until we reach the final conception, and then we would call it, I don't know, econoboyism or whatever the fuck,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, like whatever the optimal system is. So, the best system probably doesn't fit neatly into our current paradigm. And I think that one of the limitations of Radical Markets is I don't know, like there's some weird stuff in here with like the data stuff and like the immigration sponsorship. But then they take this like, again, like radical market determined view, which is probably like overly broad in its application, would be my fundamental criticism. Any final thoughts before we go on to our audience topic of the week?
I actually really like Radical Markets, even though I think I hate like a majority of the proposals and their suggestions of how to implement them. I do think, as Micah said, they're like thought-provoking in the sense of like, hey, current status quo doesn't need to be this way. Even if you're a fan of capitalism, we can do capitalism better and purer. So that's the thing that I was trying. Like, I think this is a radical marketist book rather than a radical propertarian book, and I think that's a good direction for capitalism to go in, because propertarian approaches seem to lead to less efficiency, less investment, and much greater inequality. And so in a sense, it's like it is a better kind of capitalism, which I'd much prefer. And I do agree actually with some of the arguments that when you do stuff like property taxes, land value taxes, you are partially socializing property, you are partially socializing wealth. And insofar as I think those are really useful social steps, they're great. Like, let's do them.
Yeah, in the set of potential sort of economic worldviews, Radical Markets certainly makes a unique contribution to that set, right? That it's an expansion of our current understanding of like what is possible, and in that regard, I think we can all appreciate this book. We just happen to disagree with obviously some of the maximalist sort of application of this book overall. Micah, final thoughts before we go on to our audience topic.
I hope many people write books in a similar vein with similar ideas. I hope their ideas are a little bit better. Maybe one day we can have the the author of the book on. I think there's really sharp people, okay? I think they were this close. And I'm really happy. I want more people to write stuff like this. Listen, when you try to reimagine the economy, you're going to often have big ideas which are crazy, but you need to have somebody who's coming up with something different for you to find out what works. And so I really applaud them for this.
No, I totally believe that. Like, that's what I was going to mention to Econoboy, is that I think part of the reason the ideas fail is that they're often fairly new and fairly grandiose. In fact, that it's hard to suggest a bold vision. Like, it's hard to suggest a new society where all you're suggesting is like little tweaks around the edges, and it actually inspire people to be like, hey, maybe there are better ways to run society. When like the big thing you're suggesting is DBCFT, and you write like a 500-page book on that, it's not going to inspire people to think newly about what the role of property is, I think.
Got to have some attention grabbers in there.
So, Micah, I do think it's interesting. Like, we just mentioning DBCFT. One of the things that I wished is that the way you sold DBCFT to me was a subsidy and a tax on all profit.
That's what I do now. That's what I do now. I wrote a blog post that was like this, because before I was caught in the wonk pitch, which is, well, don't you understand supernormal returns actually, and zero deadweight. No, it's like, that's way too complicated.
The reason I bring it up is I think that pitch fits very neatly actually with some of the ideas in the radical market view. Like, I wonder if you couldn't make some sort of argument for self-assessment tax in in monopoly style capital, and then DBCFT seems like a nice counterpart to that, and that you're also socializing both the benefits, the upswings and the downswings of business. You're both taxing profits and subsidizing losses to help those investments that we mentioned you're taxing earlier. I don't know, maybe when we get the Micah Irfan book, it'll have the perfect synthesis.
We're going to call it radical Irfanism. Okay, that's my book.
That's true. All right, well, that was our main topic of the week. Like we said, this will hopefully be maybe a regular series that we do. And if you have any suggestions on, I guess, schools of thought or books or things like that you wanted us to look over, feel free to
would
suggest
love
them.
some suggestions of like, here's a liberal book or here's like a social democrat book, which is like a model. When I tried to do like a big list of all the models of like that economists have put out there, it's like 4 soc dems, radical markets, and then like 40 socialist models. So
right. This is SDL's media ecosphere.
We're starving out there.
But there you go, guys. All right. Next up, audience topic of the week. This is one that's been in the pipe for a long time, and Patreons, they finally voted for it. They said, this is the week we want to learn what is the best economy in the world, and why do we think this? This is a Patreon determined topic. Like I said, patreon.com/the3wonks. Support us, pay us a little bit. You get to vote on what we talk about on a week-to-week basis. You get some special access stuff as well, which is fun for everyone. And so that's the topic of the week. What is the best economy? Whoever wants to go first. Micah, in your view, what is the best economy in the world? What makes it the best?
So,
I should clarify to the audience, we're just talking about countries here. So we're not talking about like spheres of influence or like regions. We're talking about just countries at large. Which country has the best economy? Micah.
So I think that it's really an argument between Switzerland and Estonia, but I'll say Estonia because I know more about them. Estonia is cool. They have a really good tax policy. So good, in fact, that the Tax Foundation rates them as having the best tax policy in the world year after year. And this is because they actually do have a land value tax. One of the few countries in the world that has that. They have a large value-added tax, a consumption tax, which is efficient. They have a flat tax on income and payrolls. And they have a corporate tax, which does not tax investment. It just taxes profits. So your investments are tax deductible. So there's no penalty on buying new factories and equipment and the like. And so that makes it really good from a tax perspective. But its spending is also quite efficient. The government in Estonia is digitalized. Something like 99% of government services are available online through really, really easy to use web portals. And I actually know a bit about this because I'm an Estonian e-resident. Estonia is one of the few countries in the world where you can become an e-resident, electronic resident, use their services as if you're a citizen of the country without actually ever being there. So you can apply online. I went to New York and I got my Estonian e-residency card. And you can plug it into a computer and you can actually access their financial services. What's really cool is everything's digitalized, everything's automated. They send government benefits to you, subsidies, child benefits, welfare, automatically. They use the information they have on you to just automatically give you the benefits you're eligible for. So it's a very streamlined government with also efficient programs. They have universal healthcare in the country. They have a good education system, which uses technology, and I think often tries to implement best practices in how people are taught. A very dynamic economy. They don't have deficit issues. They've kept public debt quite low. So across almost every domain, agile, efficient social spending, efficient administration, good governance, efficient tax policy, good immigration policy. Estonia is a very well administered country.
I would agree. Look, the reason I left, I had to use the bathroom. I know exactly what Micah said. He talked about the Estonian tax policy and how base they are, blah, blah, blah. Taxes are all that matters, according to Micah. No, I think Estonia is a pretty solid choice. I think that what you'll find, obviously, is that no one country is a perfect system. Estonia itself obviously doesn't have a perfectly wonky tax code. They don't tax like the full rental value of land, and
they do have a land value tax.
They do, but they don't tax the full rental value, right?
Right.
It's like a very small land value tax, and so it's just
It looks like in 2024, the taxes range from 0.1 to 1.0%, which is small. Yeah.
Right. Your full rental value of land could, depending on the lot, could be, 15, 20% or something. It could be much higher than that. And so, anyway, but the point is, it's not going to be perfectly wonky. I don't think they have a DBCFT, and I think that they still do some, you could argue, like some inefficient things with their tax system. Like, I think they do have some level of corporate tax and capital gains tax and things like that. And so, not perfectly wonky, but
I think they have full expensing.
They do have full expensing, I guess. That sounds base to me. But I think that overall, here's the reason I say Estonia is not the best, is because I just don't think that having a more wonky tax system compared to your peers, like, that's not enough for me to say you're the best economy in the world. Like, I guess I would just prioritize other things slightly, or at the very least I would say that the tax systems of other countries aren't like so bad that they cause me to sort of de-rank them substantially in terms of best economy in the world. Mike, it sounds like you had something.
You missed the rest because you decided to rudely go to the bathroom in the middle of my tirade. They have e-governance, digitalized public services, a competitive education system, a decent healthcare system, and they automatically give benefits that they're eligible for. They have very low administrative overhead and consolidation of duplicative programs. They also don't seem to have, uncompetitive random corporate welfare distortions, and they also have pretty liberalized trade as well.
Yeah. I mean, countries that got all that stuff, the Nordic countries, all right? They got all that same shit, all right? Now, they don't have as wonky a tax code, which is where I'm kind of equalizing it out. So I guess I'll go next. Nobody's going to be surprised. I think when we first instituted this topic, like several months ago on the Patreon poll, someone said, Mike is going to say Estonia, Econoboy is going to say Norway. Okay, now I don't remember what they said for what SDL would pick. Maybe they said SDL would say Norway as well, but I think the thing that Norway does really, really well, the reason why I say that Norway is like best economy in the world, is because I think that a lot of their institutional frameworks are just highly superior to other countries. Most notably, their resource management seems by far and away the best way to handle natural resource wealth. The way that they handle natural resource wealth, and this isn't just oil, they seem to take a very Georgist type mindset of like all resource rents have to flow to the state, and most production needs to flow to the state as well. Like, they take a very sort of socialize the rents type approach. Is they usually have some combination of resource rent taxation and fees associated with resource rent extraction mixed with public ownership, and then they take the returns of resources, and for the most part, and then they divide them up equitably in the form of a sovereign wealth fund, right? And I think there's many sort of justice-based arguments for this. For one, I think it's fair to say that current generations shouldn't be the only ones that benefit from natural resource wealth, especially when those resources are finite. And so a sovereign wealth fund is a great way to ensure that even future generations benefit from natural resource wealth. I think that's probably a good thing. Taxing resource rents in general is something we should be in favor of because, again, that's unproductive activity that you're taxing and socializing, which is good as well. They also have a somewhat wonky tax system, Norway does, where they do actually have relatively generous expensing and subsidy schemes for investment. Obviously, like one of the arguments for against like taxing resource rents that some libertarians will make is, well, you're disincentivizing investment, right? Because you're sort of disincentivizing you're decreasing the returns to resources and investment in general. So why would people invest? Norway says we agree. So we do a lot of public investment, but then we also allow sort of wonky tax schemes like expensing and sort of subsidization for exploration and things like that, so that we don't sort of disincentivize the extraction of this material. Now, that's just on the resource management side. I think their tax code is fundamentally fine. They have really high state capacity, like Micah said. Their administrative efficiency is extremely high. They have a hyper-democratic government, which I think helps your economy as well. And in general, the actual taxes that they levy are, within reason. They're within reason, essentially. They have a relatively competitive corporate tax. They have payroll taxes and income taxes, just like America does. And then some of the things that they do as well that I really like. I do like that they have really, really broad and wide-reaching and powerful union and labor institutions. I think that's really good. I think their worker board membership policies are really good in general as well. I'd probably go a little bit further than that, but I think those are really good. Their welfare and redistribution schemes, generally speaking, are really good. They're not optimal, right? Because they have like this sort of like guaranteed income sort of scheme where, if you fall below income, then they'll sort of top you off, which in theory creates sort of your marginal tax rates get really high. But that doesn't really destroy the economy as much as people think. And they have really robust sort of public services as well. And they invest in sort of socially optimal things like electric vehicles and like climate change mitigation, stuff like that as well. So I just, for all those reasons, I would just say in summation, Norway, highly egalitarian society, extremely robust, strong institutional design. And those are, sort of your two things, I guess, that I would care about the most. So I say Norway, you're my number one. Shout out Norway. SDL, before we get into the sort of cross comparison, what's your favorite country? Best economy in the world according to SDL?
So I was also going to pick Norway.
Oh my God.
And for many of the same reasons that you were going to mention, the sectoral bargaining is great. I know one of the neat things, which I think is interesting and could be considered wonky, is tax records are public in Norway. So every person who files has their information revealed publicly. One of the things that I've argued for in a lot of our discussions is that labor markets seem to perform better when people know what wages other people are earning. Well, now you know what everyone is earning. Everything seems to do better in that sort of transparency. I only wish they applied it more radically. So I would mostly be reduplicating what Econoboy said. So I feel like we should get to the cross comparison.
There we go. Micah, if, and I think one way to think about this, I was having an argument with a friend who said he was being very stubborn. He was saying, America's the best country. America's got the best economy. And I was like, well, imagine this, right? Imagine that you didn't know what place in society you would be born into. You were just going to be born as a random person in a country, but you get to pick which country you're randomly born into. So you don't know if you're going to be born rich or poor or black or white or whatever. You're just going to be born in a country. That's all you know. Would you pick America? Of course, the answer is no, right? Because America sucks in terms of how precarious it is to be born into. If you're born into like a poor black family in Detroit, your outcomes are like so much worse than if you're born into like a rich white family in like Beverly Hills or some shit. And whereas in Norway, if you're born like the poorest person in Norway, you're still pretty well off and taken care of in that society relative to the richest people in Norway. There's still a chasm of a difference between like a billionaire in Norway and a poor person in Norway, but that chasm isn't quite so stark as it is in America. And it's one of the reasons I would say that Norway has an edge, even over a country like Estonia. But Micah, it sounds like you would say, no, I will pick Estonia to be born into. Why is that, Micah?
So, it just doesn't have, first, Norway's richer, right? So we're going to take that off the table, right? Because that's not really a fair comparison. Estonia doesn't have the resource wealth, it has lower GDP. And
maybe they should have tried harder, Micah.
Yeah, it escaped the Soviet Union, so you have to look at their complete context, right? And I think that Estonia has handled its situation pretty much as well as any country has. Now, let's just talk about some differences that I think make Estonia's policies better than Norway's. I think Estonia uses digital governance better. I think they have more automation of their public services. They're the most, advanced e-governance in the world, from my understanding. Now, this isn't to say Norway isn't great. I think Norway is like top 5, top 3 for me. But it's just like, this is something they do seemingly extraordinarily well. Now, in terms of their tax system, Estonia's number 1. Norway is number 19. Yikes. Wow, number 19, that matters a lot. And it's because they don't have full expensing. You can't write off all your investments. They have a little wealth tax, and it's so low that it's like, why even have it? It's like 0.9%. It introduces these administrative hurdles, some capital flight.
That's right. It should be higher. Thank you, Micah.
Right. They have higher taxes on capital. So there's just some tax code elements here that make it, just a tad bit worse. They also have a higher tax burden. And some of this tax burden is unnecessary. It's imposed to support a series of subsidies that Norway maintains. Norway is nowhere near the worst in the world, but my understanding is that they do have some certain special subsidies for specific types of preferred industries. And these subsidies are not helpful, not necessary. Negative externality taxes on problematic behavior would raise revenue and not require levying general taxation on income consumption and the like, which causes economic harm to fund special industry subsidies. They also have more state monopolies. I have one study we've already talked about, which is that state-run companies in Norway, compared to competitive peers, underperform in terms of profitability. And assuming that you have efficient markets in Norway, I hope they do if they're the best country in the world.
Micah keeps saying this, guys. We've had this conversation so many times.
The fact that they have so many state-run monopolies would count against them, and also just state-run firms in aggregate. Finally, they do have sectoral bargaining in Norway. Sometimes
one of the papers that we review noted actually raised productivity by mandating it across all sectors, not just within firms with unions, right, Micah? And you love sectoral bargaining as a result.
So sectoral bargaining and their high unionization rates has certain benefits. It also causes certain harms whenever unions bargain for bad things, which I presume has happened on at least a few occasions, which I would just say is a con. Go ahead.
Well, obviously, I mean, I think that it's of course it's fair to say that these things are package deals, and similarly to how like we could imagine that like a universalist and broad welfare state might disincentivize some people to stop working. That seems like a fair concession to make. Like some people might work less and maybe not work at all if you had a universalist welfare state. But then there's like so many millions of people who much more adequately actually live up to their potential, who would otherwise be unproductive workers who become productive because they don't live in poverty and squalor for their whole lives, especially during their childhood. And so similarly, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, of course, I'm willing to concede that things like sectoral bargaining don't have literally 100% good outcomes, right? But I would just say that they have substantially more good outcomes than bad outcomes. Now, Estonia, I don't really know about Estonia's sort of labor bargaining system. Presumably, they have most European countries have at least a serviceable sort of labor movement. I don't know if Estonia just has none of that or how that works. But
yeah, I'm pretty sure like labor's just cooked like in Estonia.
Really? Okay.
My understanding is that.
I mean, that's not good if that's the case. I mean, I guess for me personally, like I really just do value the equality of the Norwegian system a lot, and I do think that. I do think that there's reasons to believe that they have a more optimal economic design for a number of reasons, that like equality is something that's good in and of itself, and that we probably should, seek to maximize that insofar as it doesn't have this like very deleterious effect on the economy. And it's not clear that Norway has had very deleterious effects on its economy as a result of its egalitarian institutions. And to Micah, to your point about like, oh, well, they have the 19th best tax system instead of the first. It's like, well, sure, but they also have like radically higher levels of equality and seemingly like, equitable economic growth and things like that, which I think probably makes up for like I would agree that your most egalitarian tax system probably sacrifices some level of efficiency, but sacrificing some level of efficiency for what we might think of as like very, very much like increased levels of equality probably would be worth it. Now, I don't think that trade-off necessarily exists. Like an ideal tax code would be both very efficient and very equal, but we're just choosing between countries right now. So, SDL, what were you going to say?
Just to speak on the labor thing, in Estonia, 33% of people are covered by collective bargaining and 10% are in unions. For Norway, the numbers are 70% covered by bargaining and 52% in unions. So about 5 times stronger union membership and about 3 times stronger coverage. Estonia does not. It's workplace or firm level, and there's no mandatory co-determination, whereas Norway has co-determination and sectoral bargaining. And so, just to be clear, like Micah, one of the things we argued is that firm level bargaining seems to result in productivity harms. So it's actually potentially like a bad policy for Estonia.
Yeah, that's an L I'm going to take on the chin. That is not particularly
Estonia.
Great. So I think we can litigate this for a long time. I think what's best to say is I think Estonia and Switzerland are probably the most liberal countries, the best manifestations of liberal ideas. And then Norway is probably the best manifestation of social democratic ideas. And we see is like, well, things are just like pretty good, actually. Like if you do either of these ideologies pretty well, things become, I mean, of course, you could always nitpick and say Norway could be more socialized and Estonia could be more liberal in certain respects. But things are great. Now, I would say is I think the structures that Estonia has implemented would have more feasible applicability to a place like the United States, where digitalizing your government is not something that requires tons of new administrative competencies. I think that the government, for instance, having a near monopoly on healthcare providers would require some administrative competencies and state capacity that we don't have. And Estonia doesn't have that problem as much. So I think the Estonian model is one that's more generalizable. With that being said, if Norway is a great place to live. No shade to anybody in Norway. Congratulations on what you've done.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe the worst economy in the world could be more interesting. I'm not sure what we would pick, because that could really truly go anywhere.
Zimbabwe.
Well, you could say, yeah, like is it like a country like Eritrea that's just like
I feel
super
like
poor, or is it like
the definition
North
for
Korea?
worst could be like absolute outcomes. Like, yeah, there's some countries in especially like sub-Saharan Africa which almost just don't have governance really. Like they're not countries in the sense of monopoly on violence in the Weberian definition. But worst, I feel like should actually be like relative to your potential, how much did you fall short? And like that's a different and interesting question.
Yeah, because it's like I don't know, I might rather be born in North Korea than Haiti, even though Haiti is like a nominally more free society. Like, I don't know, because it just seems like your institutional stability matters so much. But I'm not sure. But anyway, yeah, I mean that's kind of, you can see, like as Micah said, our best countries in the world are going to be at least, well, obviously they're going to be like heavily based on our own ideologies and our ideological journeys. Whereas it sounds like Micah maybe doesn't value the equality of Norway quite as much as he values sort of the tax efficiency of their country, which I think is definitely incorrect of Micah to do. But we all have our own little preferences, I guess.
Well, one thing I wanted to add on to this, and this might be worth doing an episode on in the future, would be like take Estonia, for example, Micah, or take Norway. What is one institution that exists in another country that you think could be imported like almost wholesale and would just unambiguously make that country better? Could be like even a minor thing. So like I point to Norway has the weird public tax system. I feel like you could take that to almost anywhere in the world. It'd probably be a net good.
I think their digitalization automatic allocation of benefits is just so smart, because think about how many people in our country, which we know have children, right? Or like we know might be eligible for the EITC, but they don't get it. Now, something we should mention is the Gini coefficient, which is the leading, measurer of the index for measuring inequality, puts Estonia at 69.2 and Norway at 72.4. So Estonia,
the Gini coefficient on what, on what, Micah? Is that on income or wealth?
I think this is income inequality.
I'm looking at different numbers.
For income is much lower for Norway. It's one of the lowest in the world.
Yeah. Some Gini coefficients on wealth will show that Norway is actually a very high wealth inequality country. But that's because they don't count the sovereign wealth fund, which is a gigantic L on all of those indices. Like, obviously the sovereign wealth fund represents like a highly egalitarian distribution of wealth, but whatever, that's just me, I guess. Anyway,
this is something, just briefly to mention, that this is something that comes up often in discussions of wealth around housing. So in some countries where there's closer to a right for housing is valued less because it's less of like a market commodity you can sell and reap the full value of. And so people are like, oh, they own less value, but you have a right to housing. And so like meaningfully, you are still getting the benefits that wealth accrues to you in other countries. It's obviously not liquid in the same way, but
I mean, just all the income inequality, like wealth inequality metrics that I'm familiar with, like the Gini, pre-tax, post-tax Gini coefficients, your 90-10 income ratios, stuff like that. I mean, pretty much all of them have Norway beating Estonia by a fair clip, let's say. The only countries I'm familiar with that typically would rank more equal than Norway would be like Slovakia and Slovenia. And I don't really know why that is. I looked a little bit into like the Slovenian model as to why that is, and it's a pretty interesting story. But anyway.
So this is from World Economics, where 100 equals perfect equality. And it says that Norway has 72.4 and Estonia has 69.2. They don't actually say whether this is income or wealth inequality. It just says inequality measure. I don't know how reliable that is. But, there is something to be said that most post-Soviet countries started out with like extreme levels of equality, which could have given Estonia an artificial benefit. That is also to say, though, Norway has a long history of social democracy, which is also contained inequality.
Well, and actually to give credit to Estonia, although they started with very low inequality, like inequality in the Soviet Union on like the day Gorbachev lost power was roughly equivalent to Sweden, like one of the most equal societies on earth. But within 5 years, it was equivalent to the United States.
The doctrine, like mass privatized to oligarchs.
Cut out, but yeah, the mass privatization was really bad for inequality. And nowadays, Russia is, again, it's comparable to the United States. So that high level of equality can be lost in like 5 years. Also the Soviet Union built it in 5 years. So like it can be very rapid, but just to give Estonia some credit, like it did keep it on the lower end of the scale. It didn't give it all up to corrupt oligarchs.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I think Slovenia, that's part of the reason why they have such a high level of equality today, was because I want to say, I think Slovenia was part of Yugoslavia, or they were part of the USSR. And basically when they were part of the Yugoslavia, okay, I get the shake head from SCL, but I think they were part of Yugoslavia. And I saw a paper that actually compared sort of the post-socialist journeys of different Yugoslavian countries, and they found that Slovenia was actually like particularly anti-shock therapy. Like they didn't privatize a lot of stuff. They did it very slowly and methodically over time. And the results just kind of speak for themselves, where Slovenia is like a relatively wealthy country, but they don't have like this very like casino capitalist type oligarchy that a lot of post-socialist countries that opened up ended up having because of shock therapy. And Estonia, yeah, is part of that probably tradition of being a little bit more methodical with their post-Soviet runs, which is good, of course, as well. But you know what's good? You know what's better than coming out of the Soviet Union? Not being part of the Soviet Union in the first place. Like Norway, okay?
One of the things I did want to bring up a funny, like, I feel like, I don't know quite how to call this, but like when Mike is mentioning all the cool tax things they have in Estonia, something I was thinking about recently is China. China has a high level of pre-tax and post-tax inequality because they have a very weakly redistributive welfare system and a regressive tax system. And the thing that's funny about that is like they mostly have consumption taxes. People pay a very high portion of their income when that's taxed into consumption taxes, and income taxes are very low and only start at a very high level. So it's funny because I feel like I could have sold this as being like an Estonian pro-efficiency type tax system, but it's buckled onto a weak and small and non-redistributive welfare system, which means it ultimately doesn't reduce inequality almost at all. So it's just sort of something that we mentioned over and over is that taxation is one side of the coin. It's just filling up the coffers. What you spend it on actually does matter quite a bit. So
it's about the efficiency, Kings. Well, this was a great episode. I'm glad that you all got to see me absolutely decimate these woke socialists on Estonia's superiority to everything they've ever advocated for.
Can't wait till Norway adopts Estonian efficient taxation, doubles it, and then does full socialism. Okay, that's right.
So base. Guys, also, I'm going to shout this out before I have to go because I do have to go. I have a YouTube channel now. I'm doing long form conversations, and the reason why I have to go is because I'm going to be recording one. If you want some more liberal wonkery, okay, you want to see the truth of liberalism, make sure to join. I'm going to be doing a video with Mr. Beat this week.
Do you have a punny name for it? I think are you doing like the Libbed Up, or what is it, Lib and Learn podcast or whatever?
Lib and Learn, yeah. We have our own channel.
You need a pun, Micah. What's the pun?
The Micah Irfan podcast. If you actually look up the top performing podcasts in the country, almost all of them are just people's names, which is surprising. I mean, Candace Owens is like number 3, and her podcast name is called Candace.
There's only one Micah
really
Irfan.
Funny.
It's easy. You search Micah Irfan, it's only him. There's only one of them.
The Friends podcast.
Oh my god!
So I'm gonna be doing a video with Mr. Beat. Also, there's a community post I have up for people that y'all want me to talk to about interesting policy topics. Trying to make a space for the burgeoning liberal movement online. It's been great talking to y'all. This is a great episode.
There we go.
See ya, Micah.
Micah's headed out. So, yeah, guys, I mean, that's pretty much our show for the week. I mean, thanks to everyone who came and listened, especially after Thanksgiving. Again, be sure to subscribe on Patreon if you want to support our show. We're very close. I think we're extremely close to $100 a month on Patreon. That's divided by the three of us. So keep in mind, always got to keep that in mind with our Patreon on the three wonks. But anyway, but no, I think overall though, become a Patreon if you want to put us over that $100 threshold. And tell your friends. Also, I believe we all three of us now have Blue Sky accounts. So I'm accountable on Blue Sky. I think Micah's just his name on Blue Sky. SDL, what's your Blue Sky account? Is it just SDL?
Sock done left, same as usual.
Okay. Sock done left. I guess SDL was taken yet again by some dastardly deviant. Yeah. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching our show this week. Become a Patreon if you want, and be sure to sub to the channel if you haven't already. And I guess, yeah, subscribe to Micah's channel if you're interested in some lib-only content. So none of this ridiculous social democratic or socialist bullshit from the two of us. All right, lib